Welcome. You've discovered ancient Rome's secret to order, designed to gently guide you into a profound, peaceful sleep. For the next several hours, you'll be immersed in the foundational legal and political struggles that shaped the Roman Republic, narrated to bring you ultimate relaxation. Let's begin now with Book 3 of Titus Livius. Now that the kings were driven out, imagine a world where laws weren't written down, leading to constant strife. How did Rome, born from chaos, find stability by codifying justice in the legendary 12 Tables? And how can the echoes of this ancient quest for order now bring stillness to your modern mind? This isn't just history, it's the very blueprint of Roman society, perfectly presented to help you unwind and achieve deep sleep. Prepare to discover how the intricate dance of ancient law can surprisingly be your new favorite path to rest. If you find this journey peaceful, please like this video, share your thoughts on Roman law in the comments below, and subscribe for more calming historical explorations. The History of Rome, Book 3. Chapter 1. Early Roman Conflicts. After the taking of Antium, Titus Aemilius and Quintus Fabius were elected consuls. This Quintus Fabius was the sole survivor of his family, which had been cut off at Cremera. In his previous consulate, Aemilius had already advocated for giving land to the people. Now, in his second consulate, both proponents of the agrarian law and the tribunes hoped to pass the measure. The tribunes, believing that a measure often opposed by both consuls might succeed with the help of at least one, took it up, and Aemilius remained steadfast in his support. Landowners and a significant portion of the patricians complained that a state leader was promoting himself through tribunicial proceedings and gaining popularity by giving away others' property. This shifted the blame from the tribunes to the consul. A violent conflict was imminent. However, Fabius resolved the issue with a solution agreeable to both parties. He proposed that a considerable tract of land, taken the previous year from the Volscians under Titus Quinius, could be used. A colony could be sent to Antium, a convenient and coastal city nearby. This would allow the common people to acquire land without complaints from existing occupiers, and the state could remain peaceful. This proposition was accepted. Titus Quintius, Aulus Verginius, and Publius Furius were appointed as triumvirs to distribute the land. Those who wished to obtain land were instructed to submit their names. However, the satisfaction of their goal led to an unexpected outcome. So few people submitted their names that Volscian colonists had to be added to fill the quota. The rest of the people preferred to clamor for land in Rome rather than receive it elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Equins sued for peace from Quintus Fabius, who had been sent there with an army. They then broke it with a sudden incursion into Latin territory. The following year, Quintus Servilius, consul with Spurius Posthumius, was sent against the Equins and encamped in Latin territory. Inaction due to disease kept the army confined to their camp. The war extended into its third year, with Quintus Fabius and Titus Quinius as consuls. Because Fabius had granted peace to the Equins as a conqueror, that province was assigned to him by special commission. He set out, confident that his reputation would bring the Equins to submission. He sent ambassadors to their national council, instructing them to state. Quintus Fabius, the consul, brought peace to Rome from the Equins. From Rome, he now brings war to the Equins, his hand now armed, which he once extended in friendship. The gods are witnesses now, and will soon be avengers of those whose treachery and perjury caused this. He, however, would still prefer that the Equins repent voluntarily rather than face an enemy's vengeance. If they repent, there will be a safe refuge in the clemency they have already experienced. But if they still delight in perjury, they will wage war with angry gods rather than with enemies. This message had so little effect that the ambassadors were nearly mistreated, and an Equine army was sent to Algidum against the Romans. When news of this reached Rome, the insult, rather than the danger, prompted the other consul to leave the city. Thus, two consular armies advanced against the enemy in battle formation, ready to engage at once. However, as little daylight remained, an enemy from the advanced guard shouted, "This is a display of war, Romans, not a battle. You draw up your army when night is near." We need more daylight for the coming contest. Return to the field tomorrow at sunrise. You shall have an opportunity to fight, have no fear." Stung by these threats, the Roman soldiers were marched back to camp, finding the approaching night tedious as it delayed the fight. They then refreshed themselves with food and sleep. The next day at dawn, the Roman army took its position considerably earlier. Eventually, the equins also advanced. The battle was fierce on both sides. The Romans fought with resentment and hatred. The equins, aware of the danger their misconduct created and despairing of future trust, were forced to desperate efforts. However, the equins could not withstand the Roman troops. When defeated, they retreated to their own territories. The enraged equine multitude, still unwilling to seek peace, began to rebuke their leaders. Their interests were risked in a pitched battle, a mode of fighting in which the Romans were superior. The equins were better suited for raids and incursions, and several parties acting in different directions conducted wars more successfully than the unwieldy mass of a single army. Leaving a guard at their camp, they marched out and attacked the Roman frontiers with such fury that they brought terror even to the city. The unexpected nature of the attack caused greater alarm, as nothing seemed less likely than for a vanquished enemy, almost besieged in their camp, to contemplate raiding. Panic-stricken peasants poured through the gates, shouting that it was not mere plundering or small bands of raiders, but exaggerating everything through unfounded fear, that entire armies and legions of the enemy were advancing, pushing toward the city, determined to assault it. Those nearest the gates relayed these uncertain, and therefore more baseless accounts to others. The hurried, confused clamor of those calling to arms bore a strong resemblance to the panic of a city under siege. It so happened that Consul Quinius had returned to Rome from Algidum. This offered some relief from their terror. With the tumult calmed, and after rebuking them for fearing a vanquished enemy, he posted guards at the gates. Then, having convened the Senate, he prepared to defend the frontiers. A suspension of civil business was proclaimed by Senate decree, and Quintus Servilius was left behind as prefect of the city. Quinius found no enemy in the countryside. The other consul conducted matters with distinguished success. He attacked the enemy wherever he knew they would appear, laden with booty and thus encumbered, making their plundering fatal. Few of the enemy escaped the ambush. All the booty was recovered. Thus, Consul Quinius's return to the city ended the public holiday, which had lasted only 4 days. A census was then held, and the lustrum, a purification ceremony, was closed by Quintius. The number of citizens counted was said to be 124,214, not including orphans of both sexes. Nothing memorable occurred afterwards among the equins. They retreated into their towns, allowing their possessions to be consumed by fire and devastation. The consul, after repeatedly raiding the entire enemy country, returned to Rome with great glory and plunder. Chapter 2. Pestilence and renewed warfare. Then Aulus Posthumius Albus and Spurius Furius Fusus were consuls. Some writers have written Fusii instead of Furius, which is noted to prevent any confusion about the identity of the persons. It was certain that one of the consuls would initiate hostilities against the equins. The equins, accordingly, sought aid from the Volscians of Aegatra. This was readily granted, so fiercely did these states harbor inveterate hatred against the Romans, and war preparations were made with the utmost vigor. The Hernicians became aware of this, and warned the Romans that the Aegatrans had revolted against the equins. The colony of Antium was also suspected because, when the town was taken, a great number of inhabitants had fled there for refuge with the equins. These individuals proved to be the bravest soldiers during the war with the equins. Afterward, when the equins were driven into their towns, these people privately withdrew. Upon returning to Antium, they swayed the colonists, who were already inclined towards treachery, away from the Romans. The matter was not yet fully developed when the Senate was informed of an intended defection. The consuls were charged to investigate by summoning the leading men of the colony to Rome. When these individuals attended without reluctance and were brought before the Senate by the consuls, their answers to the questions made them appear more suspicious than when they had arrived. At this point, war was deemed inevitable. Spurius Furius, one of the consuls to whom that province had fallen, marched against the Equins. He found the enemy raiding the Hernician countryside. Unaware of their numbers, as they had never been seen all together, he rashly risked an engagement with an army that was no match for their forces. Beaten from his ground at the first onset, he retreated to his camp. Nor did the danger end there, for both the next night and the following day, his camp was beset and assaulted so vigorously that not even a messenger could be sent from there to Rome. The Hernicians brought news of both the defeat and the besieged army, striking such terror into the Senate that the other consul, Posthumius, was charged to ensure that the Commonwealth sustained no injury, a decree form always considered one of extreme exigency. It seemed most advisable for the consul himself to remain in Rome to enlist all who could bear arms. Titus Quintius was to be sent as proconsul with the allied army to relieve the camp. To complete that army, the Latins, Hernicians, and the colony of Antium were ordered to supply Quintius with subsidiary soldiers, as auxiliaries raised for sudden emergencies were then called. During those days, many movements and attempts were made on both sides. The enemy, having a numerical advantage, tried to weaken Roman strength by dividing it into many parts, believing it insufficient for all points of attack. Simultaneously, the camp was besieged, and a part of the army was sent to devastate Roman territory and attempt to take the city itself if fortune favored them. Lucius Valerius was left to guard the city, while Consul Postumius was sent to repel attacks on the frontiers. There was no abatement in vigilance or activity anywhere. Watches were kept in the city, outposts before the gates, and guards stationed along the walls. A public holiday was observed for several days, a necessary measure in such general confusion. Meanwhile, Consul Furius, after passively enduring the siege in his camp, burst forth from the Decuman gate against the unsuspecting enemy. Although he could have pursued them, he stopped, fearing an attack on the camp from the other side. His lieutenant general, Furius, who was the consul's brother, was carried away too far by his ardor. In his eagerness to pursue, he failed to notice his own party returning or the enemy's attack on his rear. Thus cut off, after repeatedly making many unavailing efforts to force his way back to camp, he fell, fighting bravely. The consul, turning to renew the fight, heard that his brother was surrounded. Rushing into the thick of the battle more rashly than cautiously, he received a wound and was rescued with difficulty by those around him. This both dampened his own men's courage and emboldened the enemy. Encouraged by the lieutenant general's death and the consul's wound, the enemy could not be withstood by any force. The Romans were driven back within their camp and again subjected to a siege, being no match for them in hope or strength. Everything would have been imperiled had not Titus Quinius arrived with foreign troops from the Latin and Hernician army to relieve them. He attacked the Equins from the rear while they were focused on the Roman camp and insultingly displayed the lieutenant general's head. A sally was made from the camp simultaneously upon a signal given by Quintius from a distance, surrounding a great number of the enemy. The slaughter of the Equins in Roman territory was less, but their dispersion was more complete. Postumius attacked them in several places where he had posted convenient detachments, as they straggled in different directions, driving plunder before them. These scattered Equins then encountered the victorious Quintius returning with the wounded consul. Then the consular army, by their distinguished bravery, took ample vengeance for the consul's wound and for the death of the lieutenant general and the cohorts. Heavy losses were both inflicted and sustained on both sides during those days. In a matter of such antiquity, it is difficult to state with certainty the exact number of those who fought or fell. However, Antius Valerius ventures to sum them up. 5,300 Romans fell in Hernician territory. Of the Equine raiding parties that wandered through the Roman frontiers for plunder, 2,400 were slain by Consul Postumius. The rest of the force driving booty which encountered Quintius did not escape with such light losses, for 1,230 of them were slain. After this, they returned to Rome, and the order for the public holiday was discharged. The sky seemed to be all on fire, and other prodigies either actually appeared to them or exhibited imaginary appearances to their frightened minds. To avert these terrors, a solemn festival of 3 days was proclaimed, during which all the temples were filled with crowds of men and women earnestly imploring the protection of the gods. Afterward, the Latin and Hernician cohorts were sent back to their respective homes, having been thanked for their spirited military services. The 1,000 soldiers from Antium were dismissed almost with disgrace because they had arrived with assistance too late, after the battle. The elections were then held, and Lucius Abusius and Publius Servilius, elected consuls, began their term on the calends of August, then considered the start of the year. This was a distressing time. A pestilence afflicted the city and countryside, affecting both humans and livestock. The situation worsened as cattle and peasants, fleeing devastation, were admitted into the city. This crowded mix of animals and people created an unusual stench, distressed citizens, and coupled with the heat, lack of sleep, and constant contact, propagated the disease among the peasants crammed into close quarters. While the Romans struggled with these calamities, ambassadors from the Hernicians arrived suddenly with dire news. The Equins and Volscians, having united their forces, had encamped in Hernician territory and were devastating their frontiers with an immense army. The sparse attendance in the Senate already signaled to the allies that Rome was weakened by the pestilence. They then received a bleak response. The Hernicians, with the Latins, must now defend their possessions through their own efforts. The city of Rome, by the sudden anger of the gods, is now depopulated by disease. If any respite from this calamity comes, they will aid their allies, as they did the year before and always on other occasions. The allies departed, carrying home news even more distressing than what they had brought, for they were now forced to sustain a war by themselves, a conflict they had struggled with even when backed by Rome's power. The enemy did not remain confined to Hernician territory. They advanced with hostile intent into Roman lands, which were already devastated without the direct injuries of war. Finding no one to oppose them, not even an unarmed person, they passed through every place, devoid not only of troops but also of cultivation, reaching as far as the 3rd milestone on the Gabinian road. Abusius, the Roman consul, was dead. His colleague, Servilius, was barely clinging to life with faint hopes of recovery. Most of the leading men, the chief part of the patricians, and all men of military age were ill. Strength was lacking not only for the expeditions the alarm required, but even for quietly mounting guard. Senators whose age and health permitted personally performed sentinel duty. The supervision and attendance of these duties fell to the plebeian aediles, who assumed the main administration of affairs and the authority of the consular office. Thus desolate, without a head or strength, the commonwealth was saved by the guardian gods and good fortune of the city. These inspired the Volscians and Equins with the mindset of bandits rather than true enemies. No hope of taking or even approaching the walls of Rome entered their minds. The distant sight of the houses and adjacent hills diverted their thoughts from such an attempt. A murmur arose throughout the entire camp. Why waste time idly without booty in a wild and deserted land, amidst the putrid decay of cattle and humans, when they could go to places untouched by infection, like the wealthy Tusculan territory? They suddenly broke camp and, by journeys across the countryside, passed through Lavican territory to the Tusculan hills. To that quarter was the whole violence and storm of the war directed. Meanwhile, the Hernicians and Latins, moved not only by compassion but by shame, if they neither opposed the common enemy heading for Rome nor aided their besieged allies, marched to Rome with their united forces. Finding no enemy there, they followed their tracks, guided by rumor. They met the enemy descending from Tusculan territory into the Alban Valley. A battle was fought there under unequal circumstances, and their loyalty proved unfavorable to the allies for the moment. The mortality in Rome from disease was no less than that of the allies by the enemy's sword. The only surviving consul died. Other eminent figures also died, including Marcus Valerius, Titus Verginius Rutilius, the augurs, and Servius Sulpicius, the principal curio. Among less prominent individuals, the virulence of the disease spread extensively. The Senate, lacking human aid, directed the people's attention to the gods and to prayers. They were ordered to supplicate with their wives and children, earnestly imploring divine protection. In addition to personal suffering, public authority compelled them, filling all the shrines. Prostrate matrons everywhere swept the temples with their hair, begging for a remission of divine displeasure and an end to the pestilence. From this time, whether due to divine favor or the passing of the unhealthier season, the people's bodies, shaking off disease, gradually began to recover. Their attention now turned to public concerns. After several interregna, Publius Valerius Publicola, on the third day after becoming interrex, arranged for Lucretius Tricipitinus and Titus Veturius Geminus, or Volusius, to be elected consuls. They began their consulship on the third day before the Ides of August, the state now strong enough not only to repel hostile attacks, but also to act offensively. Therefore, when the Hernicians reported an enemy incursion into their frontiers, assistance was readily promised. 2 consular armies were enlisted. Veturius was sent against the Volscians to wage an offensive war. Tricipitinus, appointed to protect the allied territory from devastation, advanced no further than the country of the Hernicians. Veturius routed and put the enemy to flight in the first engagement. A party of plunderers who had marched over the Praenestan mountains and descended into the plains escaped Lucretius's notice while he was encamped among the Hernicians. These ravaged all the country around Praeneste and Gabii. From the Gabinian territory, they turned toward the heights of Tusculum. Great alarm was also excited in Rome, more from the suddenness of the affair than from a lack of strength to repel violence. Quintus Fabius was in command in the city. He secured and tranquilized things by arming the young men and posting guards. The enemy, therefore, carrying off plunder from adjacent places, and not daring to approach the city, were returning by a circuitous route. Their caution was more relaxed as they moved farther from the enemy's city. They encountered Consul Lucretius, who had already scouted their movements, drawn up in battle array and determined on an engagement. Attacking them with predetermined resolution, while they were struck with sudden panic, though considerably fewer in numbers, the Romans routed and put their numerous army to flight. They drove them into deep valleys, where escape was difficult, and surrounded them. There, the Volscian nation was almost entirely cut off. Some histories state that 13,470 fell in the field and in the pursuit, that 1,250 were taken alive, and 27 military standards were captured. While there may have been some exaggeration in the number, there was certainly great slaughter. The victorious consul, having obtained immense booty, returned to the same standing camp. Then the consuls joined their camps. The Volscians and Equins also united their shattered forces. This was the third battle that year. The same good fortune brought victory. The enemy was defeated, and their camp was also taken. Thus, affairs at Rome returned to their former state, and successes abroad immediately stirred up commotions in the city. Caius Terentillus Arsa was tribune of the people that year. He believed an opportunity for tribunician intrigues was at hand due to the consul's absence. After railing against the arrogance of the patricians for several days before the people, he inveighed chiefly against the consular authority, deeming it exorbitant and intolerable in a free state. He argued that it was only less invidious in name, but in reality, almost more oppressive than that of kings. 2 masters had been adopted instead of one, with unbounded, unlimited power, who, themselves unrestrained, directed all the terrors of the law and all kinds of severity against the commons. Now, to prevent this licentious power from continuing perpetually, he proposed a law, that 5 persons be appointed to draw up laws regarding consular power. The consul should use only the right that the people might give him over them, and not hold their own caprice and licentiousness as law. When this law was published, the patricians feared that, in the consul's absence, they would be subjected to the yoke. The Senate was convened by Quintus Fabius, prefect of the city, who vehemently opposed the bill, and its author that no threat or intimidation was omitted. He even suggested that both consuls, in their exasperation, would surround the tribune. Fabius argued that Terentillus had lain in wait and, watching his opportunity, made an attack on the commonwealth. If the gods in their anger had given them any tribune like him the preceding year, during the pestilence and war, he could not have withstood. With both consuls dead and the exhausted state lying enfeebled in universal confusion, he would have proposed laws to abolish the consular government altogether from the state. He would have led the Volscians and Equins to attack the city. What? Fabius continued. If the consuls adopted any tyrannical or cruel proceedings against any of the citizens, was it not competent to him to appoint a day of trial for him, to arraign him before those very judges against any one of whom severity may have been exercised? It was not the consular authority, but the tribunician power that he was rendering hateful and insupportable. This power, having been peaceful and reconciled to the patricians, was now about to be brought back anew to its former mischievous habits. Nor would he entreat him not to go on as he commenced. "Of you, the other tribunes," said Fabius, "we request that you will first of all consider that that power was provided for the aid of individuals, not for the ruin of the community. You were created tribunes of the commons, not enemies of the patricians. To us it is distressing, to you a source of odium, that the Republic, now bereft of its chief magistrates, should be attacked. You will diminish not your rights, but the odium against you. Confer with your colleague, that he may postpone this business until the arrival of the consuls. Even the Equins and the Volscians, when our consuls were carried off by pestilence last year, did not press on us with a cruel and tyrannical war. The tribunes conferred with Terentillus, and the bill, to all appearances deferred but in reality abandoned, led to the immediate summoning of the consuls. Lucretius returned with immense spoils and much greater glory. He enhanced this glory upon his arrival by displaying all the booty in the Campus Martius. For 3 days anyone could reclaim their property. The remainder, for which no owners appeared, was sold. A triumph was universally due to the consul, but the matter was postponed as the tribune continued to press his law, which seemed more important to the consul. The issue was debated for several days in both the Senate and before the people. At length, the tribune yielded to the consul's authority and desisted. Then, the proper honor was rendered to the general and his army. He triumphed over the Volscians and Equins, with his troops following him in the procession. The other consul was permitted to enter the city in an ovation without his soldiers. The following year, the Terentilian law, taken up by the entire college, assailed the new consuls, Publius Volumnius and Servius Sulpicius. That year, the sky seemed to be on fire, and a violent earthquake occurred. It was now believed that an ox spoke, a circumstance that had not gained credit the year before. Among other prodigies, it also rained flesh. A great number of birds reportedly intercepted this shower by flying, and what did fall is said to have lain scattered for several days, its smell showing no change. The sacred books were consulted by the duumviri for sacred rites. Dangers of attacks on the highest parts of the city and resulting bloodshed were predicted to come from an assembly of strangers. Among other things, an admonition was given that all internal disturbances should cease. The tribunes alleged that this was done to obstruct the law, and a desperate contest was at hand. Lo, as if the same cycle of events revolved every year, the Hernicians brought word that the Volscians and Equins, though their strength was much impaired, were recruiting their armies. Their main reliance was Antium, and its inhabitants openly held councils at Agetra. That, the Hernicians claimed, was the source and strength for the war. As soon as this announcement was made in the Senate, a levy was ordered. The consuls were commanded to divide the management of the war between them, with the Volscians as one's province and the Equins as the other's. The tribunes cried out in the forum, "The Volscian war is a concerted farce. The Hernicians are instructed to act their parts. The liberty of the Roman people is no longer crushed by manly efforts, but baffled by cunning. Since there is no probability that the almost exterminated Volscians and the Equins would start hostilities on their own, new enemies are sought. A loyal colony, and one in their very vicinity, is being slandered. War is proclaimed against the unoffending people of Antium, but in reality, it is waged against the commons of Rome. After loading them with arms, they are determined to drive them out of the city with precipitous haste, wreaking vengeance on the tribunes through the exile and expulsion of their fellow citizens. By these means, and let them not think there is any other objective, the law is defeated. Unless, while the matter is still in abeyance, while they are still at home and in civilian clothes, they take precautions that they may not be driven out of possession of the city and subjected to the yoke. If they only had spirit, support would not be lacking. All the tribunes are unanimous. There is no apprehension from abroad, no danger. The gods ensured last year that their liberty could now be defended safely. Thus spoke the tribunes. But, on the other side, the consuls, having placed their chairs within view, proceeded with the levy. The tribunes hastened there, drawing the assembly with them. A few were cited as an experiment, and instantly violence commenced. Whomever the lictor seized by order of the consul, the tribune ordered to be discharged. Neither's proper jurisdiction set a limit for each. Whatever one set their mind upon was to be attained by the hope of strength and by force. Just as the tribunes had behaved in impeding the levy, so did the consuls conduct themselves in obstructing the law, which was brought up every assembly day. The riot began when the tribunes ordered the people to vote, as the patricians refused to withdraw. The elder citizens scarcely attended the contest, as it was one likely to be driven by temerity and daring rather than prudence. The consuls also generally kept out of the way, lest in the general confusion they expose their dignity to insult. There was a young man, Ciso Quintius, a daring youth, distinguished by his noble descent, personal size, and strength. To these God-given endowments, he had added many military honors and eloquence in the forum, so that no person in the state was considered more effective in speaking or acting. When this person took his place in the center of a body of patricians, conspicuous above the rest, wielding what seemed to be dictatorships and consulships combined in his eloquence and physical strength, he alone withstood the storms of the tribunes and the populace. Under his guidance, the tribunes were frequently driven from the forum, the commons routed and dispersed. Those who crossed his path were ill-treated and stripped, making it evident that if he were allowed to continue this way, the law would be defeated. Then the other tribunes, almost despairing, Aulus Verginius, one of the college, initiated a criminal prosecution on a capital charge against Ciso. This proceeding, however, irritated rather than intimidated his violent temper. He opposed the law even more vigorously, annoyed the commons, and persecuted the tribunes as if waging a regular war. The prosecutor allowed the accused to rush headlong, heightening the charges against him with the popular hatred thus incurred. Meanwhile, he proceeded with the law, not so much in the hope of passing it as to provoke Ciso's temerity. Many inconsiderate expressions and actions among the young men were attributed to Ciso's temper due to the prejudice against him. Still, the law was resisted. Aulus Verginius frequently remarked to the people, "Are you even now sensible that you cannot have Ciso as a fellow citizen with the law which you desire? Though why do I say law? He is an opponent of your liberty. He surpasses all the Tarquins in arrogance. Wait until he is made consul or dictator, whom, though but a private citizen, you now see exercising kingly sway over you by his strength and audacity." Many assented, complaining that they had been beaten by him, and strongly urged the tribune to continue the prosecution. The day of trial approached, and it was evident that people generally believed their liberty depended on Ciso's condemnation. Then, finally compelled, he addressed the commons individually, though with strong indignation. His relatives followed him, as did the principal members of the state. Titus Quintius Capitolinus, who had been thrice consul, after recounting many splendid achievements of his own and his family, stated that neither in the Quintian family nor in the Roman state had such promising genius and such early valor appeared. He had first been his soldier, Capitolinus claimed, and had often, in his sight, fought against the enemy. Spurius Furius declared that he, having been sent to him by Quintius Capitolinus, had come to his aid when in the midst of danger. There was no individual by whose exertions he considered the commonweal more effectually re-established. Lucius Lucretius, the consul of the preceding year, in the full splendor of recent glory, shared his own services with Ciso. He recounted his battles, detailed his distinguished exploits both on expeditions and in the field. He advised and recommended that they prefer this extraordinary young man, endowed with all the advantages of nature and rank, and one who would prove of the utmost importance to the interest of that state into which he should come, to be their fellow citizen, rather than the citizen of a foreign state. Regarding what may be offensive in him, his heat and vehemence, Lucretius stated, time would diminish daily. The prudence that may be wanting in him was increasing daily. As his faults declined and his virtues ripened to maturity, they should allow such distinguished men to grow old in their state. Among these his father, Lucius Quintius, who bore the surname Cincinnatus, without dwelling on his merits, lest he heighten public hatred, but soliciting pardon for his errors and his youth, implored them to forgive his son for his sake, a man who had not offended anyone by word or deed. But some, out of respect or fear, turned away from listening to his entreaties. Others, complaining that they and their friends had been ill-treated, declared their sentence beforehand through the harshness of their answer. Independent of the general odium, one charge weighed heavily on the accused, Marcus Volscius Victor, who some years before had been tribune of the people, came forward as a witness. He testified that, not long after the pestilence in the city, he had encountered a party of young men rioting in the Suburra. A scuffle arose there, and his elder brother, not yet fully recovered from his illness, had fallen down almost dead, struck with a fist by Ciso. He was carried home by several persons, and Volscius believed he died from that blow, and that he had not been permitted by the consuls of former years to pursue the matter. In consequence of Volscius voicing these charges, the people became so excited that Ciso was nearly killed through their violence. Verginius ordered him seized and carried to prison. The patricians opposed force with force. Titus Quintius exclaimed that a person for whom a day of trial for a capital offense has been appointed, and whose trial was now at hand, ought not to be outraged before trial and without a sentence being passed. The tribune replied that he would not inflict punishment on him before condemnation, but he would keep him in prison until the day of trial, so that the Roman people might have an opportunity of punishing one who had killed a man. The tribunes, being appealed to, secured their prerogative by adopting a middle course. They forbade his imprisonment and declared it their wish that the accused appear at his trial, with a sum of money promised to the people in case he should not appear. The amount of money to be promised came under discussion, which was referred to the Senate. The accused was detained in the public assembly until the patricians could be consulted. It was determined that he should give bail. Each bail was set at 3,000 asses. The number of sureties was left to the tribunes, who limited it to 10. For 10 sureties, the prosecutor discharged the accused. He was the first who gave public sureties. Being discharged from the forum, he went the following night into exile among the Etrurians. On the day of trial, when it was pleaded that he had left home to go into exile, Verginius nonetheless held the assembly. His colleagues, when appealed to, dismissed the assembly. The fine was rigorously exacted from the father, so that after selling all his effects, he lived for a considerable time in a solitary cottage on the other side of the Tiber, as if in exile. This trial and the proposing of the law fully occupied the state, ensuring quiet. The tribunes, emboldened by their perceived victory and the banishment of Ciso, believed the law was all but passed. The patricians, dismayed and feeling marginalized, seemed to have relinquished their role in governing the commonwealth. However, the younger patricians, particularly Ciso's close friends, intensely resented the commons. They refused to yield, tempering their animosity with a new moderation. When the law was next proposed, they appeared well prepared with a large number of clients. They confronted the tribunes, who had provided a pretext by attempting to remove them, so effectively that no one person stood out for either glory or blame. The people simply complained that for one Ciso, 1,000 more had appeared. On the days between the tribunes' attempts to advance the law, these same young patricians were mild and peaceful. They greeted plebeians courteously, engaged in conversation, and invited them to their homes. They attended the forum, allowing the tribunes to hold their meetings without interruption. They were never impolite, in public or private, unless the discussion turned to the law. Otherwise, the young men were popular. The tribunes conducted all their other affairs undisturbed, and were even re-elected for the following year without a single offensive word or act of violence. Through soothing and managing the commons, the young patricians gradually made them more compliant, and by these methods, the law was evaded for the entire year. The consuls, Gaius Claudius and Publius Valerius Publicola, found the state in a calmer condition. The new year brought no significant change. The debate over the law consumed everyone. The more the younger senators tried to win favor with the commons, the more strenuously the tribunes opposed them, making them suspicious by alleging a conspiracy. They claimed Piso was in Rome, plotting to assassinate the tribunes and butcher the commons. They asserted that the elder patricians had commissioned the young men to abolish tribunician power and restore the government to its state before the Sacred Mount was occupied. Chapter 3. Herdonius's Uprising. Amidst this, a war with the Volsci and Equi, a regular occurrence almost every year, was anticipated. Then, another threat emerged unexpectedly closer to home. Appius Herdonius, a Sabine, leading 4,500 exiles and slaves, seized the capital and citadel during the night. A massacre immediately ensued in the citadel, targeting those who refused to join the conspiracy and take up arms. Some, in a panic, ran down to the forum, where cries of "to arms" and "the enemy are in the city" echoed. The consuls hesitated, fearing both to arm the commons and to leave them unarmed. They were uncertain whether the sudden calamity was external or internal, stemming from the hatred of the commons or the treachery of the slaves. They attempted to quell the tumults, which sometimes only exacerbated the panic-stricken populace, who could not be controlled by authority. They did distribute arms, but selectively, ensuring enough protection for all emergencies while the enemy remained unclear. The rest of the night was spent posting guards throughout the city, anxious and uncertain about the enemy's identity and numbers. Daylight revealed the war and its leader. From the capital, Appius Herdonius summoned the slaves to liberty, declaring he had taken up the cause of the unfortunate to restore the oppressed to their country and remove the grievous yoke from the enslaved. He preferred this to be done with the Roman people's authority, but if there was no hope there, he would rouse the Volscians and Equi and try every extreme measure. The situation became clearer to the patricians and consuls. Beyond the declared motives, they feared this might be a scheme by the Veientes or Sabines. With so many enemies within the city, they worried Sabine and Etrurian troops might arrive as planned, followed by their perennial enemies, the Volscians and Equi, who would then come not to ravage their territories, but to their partially captured city. Their fears were many and varied. Most prominent was their dread of the slaves. That each household might harbor an enemy, it was neither safe to trust nor to mistrust, lest distrust incite them further. The crisis seemed almost insurmountable even with perfect harmony between the state's different orders. No one currently apprehended the tribunes or commons. Other, more pressing evils constantly arose, making that particular issue seem mild and typically only resurfacing when other threats subsided. External terror appeared to have lulled it to rest. Yet, it was precisely this issue that most aggravated their distress, for such madness seized the tribunes that they argued the capital had been seized not by war, but by the mere appearance of war, designed to distract the people from the law. They claimed these friends and clients of the patricians would depart more silently than they arrived, once they realized their tumults had been in vain, if the law were passed. They then held a meeting to pass the law, calling the people away from their arms. Meanwhile, the consuls convened the Senate, facing a new dread from the tribunes, greater than that caused by the night's foe. When it was announced that arms were being laid aside and men were abandoning their posts, Publius Valerius, his colleagues still detaining the Senate, rushed from the Senate house to the tribunes' meeting. "What is this, tribunes?" he demanded. "Are you determined to overthrow the commonwealth under the guidance of Appius Herdonius? Has he so successfully corrupted you, though he couldn't even sway your slaves? When the enemies are upon us, Do you choose to surrender arms and propose laws? Then, turning to the populace, if, Romans, no concern for your city, for yourselves, moves you, at least revere the gods of your country, now held captive by the enemy. Jupiter, the best and greatest, Queen Juno, Minerva, and the other gods and goddesses are besieged. A camp of slaves now holds the tutelary deities of the state. Does this seem to you the behavior of a sane state? Such a crowd of enemies is not only within our walls, but in the citadel, commanding the Forum and Senate House. Meanwhile, meetings are held in the Forum. The Senate sits in the Senate House, as if perfect tranquility prevails. One senator gives his opinion, other Romans cast their votes. Would it not be fitting for all patricians and commons, consuls, tribunes, citizens, and all classes, to bring aid with arms in their hands, to run into the capital, to liberate and restore to peace that most august residence of Jupiter, the best and greatest? O Father Romulus, infuse into your descendants that determination of yours, by which you once recovered the citadel from these same Sabines, when it was gained by gold. Order them to pursue this same path that you, as leader, and your army pursued. Behold, I, as consul, shall be the first to follow you in your footsteps, as far as a mortal can follow a god. He concluded, I will take up arms, and I invite every citizen of Rome to arms. If anyone should oppose, I, forgetting consular authority, tribunician power, and devoting laws, will consider him an enemy, whoever he may be, wherever he may be, in the capital or in the Forum. The tribunes may order arms to be taken up against Publius Valerius the consul, since they forbid it against Appius Herdonius. I will venture to act towards the tribunes as the founder of my family ventured to act towards kings. It became apparent that extreme violence was imminent, and a Roman disturbance would be a spectacle for the enemy. However, the law could neither be prepared, nor could the consul proceed to the capital. Night quelled the nascent conflict. The tribunes yielded to the darkness, fearing the consul's arms. With the instigators of the disturbances gone, the patricians circulated among the commons, joining their conversations and introducing observations suited to the occasion. They advised them to beware into what hazard they were bringing the commonwealth, that the contest was not between the patricians and commons, but that patricians and commons together, the fortress of the city, the temples of the gods, the guardian gods of the state and of private families, were being delivered up to the enemy. While these efforts were made in the Forum to appease the disturbances, the consuls had, in the meantime, armed the several gates and walls, lest the Sabines or the Veientian enemy make a move. That same night, messengers arrived in Tusculum announcing that the citadel was taken, the capital seized, and the city in a state of turmoil. Lucius Mamilius, then dictator at Tusculum, immediately convened the Senate and introduced the messengers. He earnestly advised them not to wait for ambassadors from Rome to beg for assistance, arguing that the danger itself, their shared gods, and the faith of treaties demanded action. He declared that the gods would never offer them an equal opportunity to oblige such a powerful state and so near a neighbor. It was decided that assistance should be sent. The young men were enrolled and armed. Arriving in Rome at daybreak, they initially appeared to be enemies from a distance. The Equi or Volscians seemed to be approaching. But when the groundless alarm was dispelled, they were admitted into the city and descended as a body into the Forum. There, Publius Valerius, having left his colleague to guard the gates, was now drawing up his forces. The great influence of the man had been effective when he affirmed that, the capital being recovered and the city restored to peace, if they would allow themselves to be convinced what lurking fraud was concealed under the law proposed by the tribunes, he would offer no obstruction to the meeting of the people, mindful of his ancestors, mindful of his surname, and that the province of protecting the people had been handed down to him as hereditary. Following him as their leader, despite the tribunes' outcries, they marched up the Capitoline Hill. The Tusculan troops also joined them. Allies and citizens vied with each other for the honor of recovering the citadel. Each leader encouraged his men. The enemy, terrified, now relied solely on the strength of their position. The Romans and allies advanced on them in this state of alarm. They had now broken into the porch of the temple when Publius Valerius, animating the fight at the head of his men, was slain. Publius Volumnius, a man of consular rank, saw him fall. Directing his men to cover the body, he rushed forward to take on the role and office of consul. In their ardor and impetuosity, the soldiers did not fully comprehend this heavy blow. They conquered before they realized they were conquering without a leader. Many of the exiles defiled the temple with their blood. Many were taken alive. Herdonius was slain. Thus, the capital was recovered. Punishment was inflicted on each prisoner according to his station, whether freeman or slave. It is said the commons threw farthings into the consul's house, so he might be buried with greater solemnity. With peace restored, the tribunes pressed the patricians to fulfill Publius Valerius's promise. They urged Claudius to clear his deceased colleague's name of bad faith and allow the law to proceed. The consul insisted he would permit discussion of the law only after a replacement was appointed for the fallen consul. These disputes continued until the consular elections. In December, through the patricians' zealous efforts, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, Ciso's father, was elected consul to assume office immediately. The commons were dismayed. They would now have a consul who was angry with them, powerful through patrician support, his own merit, and 3 sons, each as spirited as Ciso, but superior in prudence and moderation when needed. Upon taking office, Quintius, in his frequent speeches from the tribunal, was equally vehement in restraining the commons and reproving the Senate. He accused the Senate's listlessness of allowing the tribunes, now perpetual, to wield regal authority through their speeches and prosecutions, as if in an ill-regulated family, not a Roman republic. With my son Ciso, he declared, fortitude, constancy, all the splendid qualifications of youth in war or peace, have been driven and exiled from Rome. Yet talkative and turbulent men, sowers of discord, twice and even thrice re-elected tribunes, live in destructive practices with regal tyranny. Did that Aulus Verginius, he asked, deserve less punishment than Appius Herdonius, because he was not in the capital? Considerably more, by Jove, in the mind of anyone who would judge fairly. Herdonius, if nothing else, by avowing himself an enemy, in a manner gave you notice to take up arms. This man, by denying the existence of war, took arms out of your hands and exposed you defenseless to your slaves and exiles. And did you, no offense to Caius Claudius and the late Publius Valerius, did you advance against the Capitoline Hill before you expelled those enemies from the Forum? It is shameful before gods and men. When the enemy were in the citadel, in the very capital, when the leader of the exiles and slaves, after profaning everything, took up his residence in the shrine of Jupiter, the best and greatest, arms were taken up in Tusculum sooner than in Rome. It was a matter of doubt whether Lucius Mamilius, the Tusculan leader, or Publius Valerius and Caius Claudius, the consuls, recovered the Roman citadel. We, who formerly did not suffer the Latins to touch arms, even in their own defense, when they had the enemy on their very frontiers, should have been taken and destroyed now, had not the Latins taken up arms of their own accord. Tribunes, is this bringing aid to the commons, to expose them in a defenseless state to be butchered by the enemy? Now, if any one, even the humblest individual of your commons, that portion you have as it were broken off from the rest of the state, and made your country and peculiar commonwealth, if any of these persons were to bring word that his house was beset by an armed band of slaves, you would think that assistance should be afforded to him. Was Jupiter, the best and greatest, when surrounded by the arms of exiles and of slaves, deserving of no human aid? And do these persons require that they be considered sacred and inviolable, with whom the gods themselves are neither sacred nor inviolable? But, steeped as you are in crimes against both gods and men, do you say that you will pass your law this year? Truly then, the day on which I was created consul was a disastrous day for the Commonwealth, much more so even than that on which Publius Valerius the consul fell, if you should carry it. Now first of all, he concluded, Romans, it is the intention of myself and my colleague to march the legions against the Volsci and the Equi. I know not by what fatality we find the gods more propitious when we are at war than in peace. How great the danger from those states would have been, Had they known that the capital was besieged by exiles, it is better to conjecture from the past than to feel from actual experience. The consul's harangue deeply affected the commons. The patricians, recovering their spirits, felt the state was re-established. The other consul, more eager to second a measure than to initiate it, readily allowed his colleague to take the lead in this important matter, claiming his share of consular duty in executing the plan. The tribunes, mocking these declarations as empty, then inquired how the consuls would lead out the army, as no one would allow them to hold a levy. "But," said Quinius, "we have no need for a levy." When Publius Valerius gave arms to the commons to recover the capital, they all swore an oath to him that they would assemble on an order from the consul and would not depart without an order. "We therefore publish our order that all of you who have sworn attend tomorrow under arms at Lake Regillus." The tribunes then began to quibble, wanting to absolve the people from their obligation, arguing that Quinius was a private person when they took the oath. However, the disregard for the gods prevalent in the present age had not yet arrived. Not everyone, by their own interpretation, twisted oaths and laws to suit their purposes. Rather, they adapted their conduct to them. Therefore, the tribunes, with no hope of obstructing the matter, attempted to delay the army's departure more earnestly. A report had spread that augurs had been ordered to attend at Lake Regillus to consecrate a place where business could be transacted with the people under favorable auspices. Whatever had been passed in Rome by tribunician violence could then be repealed in an assembly there. All would agree to the consul's wishes, for there was no appeal at a distance greater than a mile from the city, and the tribunes, if they came, would, among the rest of the crowd, be subjected to consular authority. These matters alarmed them, but the greatest terror was Quinius's frequent assertion that he would not hold a consular election. He claimed the state suffered from a disease that ordinary remedies could not stop. The Commonwealth required a dictator, he said, so that whoever disturbed the peace of the state would feel that the dictatorship was without appeal. The Senate assembled in the capital. The tribunes arrived there with the commons in great consternation. The populace, with loud clamors, implored the protection of the consuls, and then the patricians. They could not make the consul recede from his determination until the tribunes promised to be guided by the patricians. Then, with the consul presenting the demands of the tribunes and commons, Senate decrees were passed, that neither the tribunes should propose the law during that year, and that the consuls should not lead the army from the city, that for the time to come, the Senate decided that it was to the injury of the Commonwealth, that the same magistrates should be continued, and the same tribunes be reappointed. The consuls conformed to the Senate's authority. The tribunes, however, were reappointed despite the consuls' remonstrances. The patricians, not to be outdone by the commons, also re-elected Lucius Quintius consul. No consular proceeding was urged with more warmth during the entire year. "Can I be surprised," he said, "if your authority is of little weight, conscript fathers? You yourselves are disparaging it. Because the commons have violated a decree of the Senate by reappointing their magistrates, you yourselves also wish it to be violated, lest you should yield to the populace in rashness, as if to possess greater power in the state consisted in having more of inconstancy and irregularity. For it is certainly more inconstant and greater folly to do away with one's own decrees and resolutions than those of others. Imitate, conscript fathers, the inconsiderate multitude, and you, who should be an example to others, transgress by the example of others, rather than others should act correctly by yours. Provided I imitate not the tribunes, nor suffer myself to be re-elected consul, contrary to a decree of the Senate. But I advise you, Caius Claudius, that both you on your part restrain the Roman people from this licentiousness, and that you be persuaded of this on my part, that I shall so take it, as not to consider that my honor has been obstructed by you, but that the glory of declining the honor has been augmented, and the odium, which would hang over me from its being continued, has been lessened. Upon this, they jointly issued an order, that no one should attempt to make Lucius Quintius consul. If anyone should do so, that they would not allow that vote. The consuls elected were Quintus Fabius Vibulanus, for the third time, and Lucius Cornelius Meluginensis. The census was performed that year. It was a matter of religious scruple that the lustrum should be closed, on account of the capital having been taken and the consul slain. In the consulate of Quintus Fabius and Lucius Cornelius, disturbances broke out immediately at the commencement of the year. The tribunes were urging on the commons. The Latins and Hernici brought word that a formidable war was in preparation by the Volscians and Equi. Volscian troops were already at Antium. Great apprehension was also entertained that the colony itself would revolt. With difficulty, the tribunes were prevailed upon to allow the war to take precedence. The consuls then divided their provinces. It was assigned to Fabius to march the legions to Antium, and to Cornelius to protect the city, lest any part of the enemy, as was the practice of the Equi, should come to commit depredations. The Hernici and Latins were ordered to supply soldiers in conformity with the treaty, and in the army, 2 parts consisted of allies, 1 part of natives. When the allies arrived on the appointed day, the consul pitched his camp outside the Capuan gate. Then, after the army was purified, he set out for Antium and encamped not far from the town and the enemy's standing camp. There, the Volscians, not daring to risk an engagement, prepared to protect themselves quietly within their ramparts. On the following day, Fabius drew up not 1 mixed army of allies and citizens, but 3 separate bodies from the 3 states around the enemy's works. He himself was in the center with the Roman legions. He ordered them to watch for the signal from thence, so that the allies might both commence the action together and retire together if he sounded a retreat. He placed their cavalry in the rear of each division. Having thus assailed the camp at 3 different points, he surrounded it. When he pressed on from every side, he dislodged the Volscians, unable to sustain his attack from the rampart. Having then crossed the fortifications, he expelled the dismayed crowd, who were inclining towards one direction from the camp. Upon this, the cavalry, who could not easily pass over the rampart, having stood by until that period as mere spectators of the fight, having come up with them while flying in disorder on the open plain, enjoyed a share of the victory by cutting down the affrighted troops. The slaughter of them as they fled was great, both in the camp and outside the lines, but the booty was still greater, because the enemy were scarcely able to carry off their arms with them. Their entire army would have been destroyed, had not the woods covered them in their flight. While these events unfolded at Antium, the Equi meanwhile sent forth the main strength of their youth. They surprised the citadel of Tusculum by night, and with the rest of their army, encamped not far from the Tusculan walls, effectively dividing the enemy's forces. This news quickly reached Rome, and from Rome to Antium, impacting the Romans as profoundly as if the capital itself had been taken. So fresh were the Tusculans' recent services, and the very similarity of the danger seemed to demand a return of the aid they had provided. Fabius, abandoning all other objectives, hastily moved the booty from the camp to Antium. Leaving a small garrison there, he hurried his army by forced marches to Tusculum. The soldiers were allowed to carry nothing but their arms and whatever prepared provisions were at hand. Consul Cornelius dispatched provisions from Rome. The war at Tusculum continued for several months. With one part of his army, the consul assaulted the Equi's camp. Another part he assigned to the Tusculans to recover their citadel. They could never have taken it by force. Famine at length drove the enemy out, and when they finally yielded, they were all sent under the yoke by the Tusculans, unarmed and naked. As these disarmed Equi fled ignominiously homeward, the Roman consul overtook them on Mount Algidum and cut them down to a man. After this victory, having marched his army back to Cleumen, the name of the place, he pitched his camp. The other consul, as soon as the Roman walls were no longer in danger from the defeated enemy, also set out from Rome. Thus the consuls, having entered the enemy's territories from 2 different sides, strenuously vied with each other in laying waste the lands of the Volscians on one hand and the Equi on the other. I find in some writers that the people of Antium revolted the same year. However, I would not venture to affirm for certain that Lucius Cornelius, the consul, conducted that war and took the town, because no mention is made of the matter among the older writers. This war concluded, a tribunician conflict at home alarmed the Senate. They exclaimed that holding the army abroad was a fraudulent motive, that such frustration aimed to abolish the law, but that they, the tribunes, would nevertheless see their undertaking through. Publius Lucretius, the city prefect, however, managed to postpone the tribunes' proceedings until the consul's arrival. A new cause of disturbance also arose. Aulus Cornelius and Quintus Servilius, quaestors, set a trial date for Marcus Volscius, for having come forward as a manifestly false witness against Ciso. It appeared by many proofs that Volscius's brother, from the time he first became ill, not only never appeared in public, but had not even risen from his sickbed, and died of an illness of several months' standing. Moreover, at the time to which the witness had referred to the commission of the crime, Ciso had not been seen in Rome. Those who served in the army with him positively stated that at that time he had constantly attended his post with them, without any leave of absence. Many persons, on their own private responsibility, proposed to Volscius to have a judicial decision on the matter. As he would not venture to go to trial, all these coinciding factors made Volscius's condemnation no less certain than Ciso's had been on Volscius's testimony. The tribunes caused a delay, stating they would not allow the quaestors to hold the assembly concerning the accused unless it was first held concerning the law. Thus, both matters were spun out until the arrival of the consuls. When the consuls entered the city in triumph with their victorious army, many thought the tribunes were dismayed because silence was observed regarding the law. But the tribunes, it being the close of the year and desirous of a fourth tribuneship, had shifted their efforts from the law to canvassing for elections. When the consuls strove with no less strenuousness than if the law itself proposed to lessen their dignity, the victory in the contest went to the tribunes. In the same year, peace was granted to the Equi upon their suing for it. The census, begun the preceding year, was completed. The number of citizens rated was 117,319. The consuls obtained great glory this year both at home and in war, because they re-established peace both abroad and at home. Though the state was not in a state of absolute concord, it was less disturbed than at other times. Lucius Minucius and Caius Nautius, elected as the next consuls, took up the two causes that had carried over from the preceding year. The consuls obstructed the law, and the tribunes, in turn, obstructed the trial of Volscius. However, the new quaestors had greater power and influence. Marcus Valerius, son of Valerius and grandson of Valesus, was appointed quaestor alongside Titus Quintius Capitolinus, who had been thrice consul. Since Ciso could neither be restored to the Quintian family, nor, though a most promising young man, to the state, he justly, and as in duty bound, prosecuted the false witness who had deprived an innocent person of the power to plead his cause. The Equi, however, did not allow them long rest. In violation of the treaty made with the Romans the year before, they conferred chief command on Gracchus Clelius, then the leading man among the Equi. Under Gracchus's command, they carried hostile depredations into the district of Lavisae, and from there into Tusculum. Laden with booty, they pitched their camp at Algidum. To that camp came Quintus Fabius, Publius Volumnius, and Aulus Posthumius, to complain of the wrongs committed and to demand restitution in accordance with the treaty. The general of the Equi commanded them to deliver to the oak whatever instructions they brought from the Roman Senate, that he in the meantime should attend to other matters. A large oak tree hung over the praetorium, its shade providing a pleasant seat. Then one of the ambassadors, when departing, declared, "Let both this consecrated oak and all the gods hear the treaty violated by you, and favor both our complaints now, and our arms presently, when we shall simultaneously avenge the rights of gods and men as violated by you." As soon as the ambassadors returned to Rome, the Senate ordered one of the consuls to lead his army against Gracchus at Algidum. To the other, they assigned the province of laying waste to the country of the Equi. The tribunes, according to their practice, attempted to obstruct the levy, and probably would have eventually prevented it, but a new cause of alarm was suddenly added. A large body of Sabines, committing dreadful devastation, approached very close to the city walls. The fields were laid waste, and the city was struck with terror. Then the commons cheerfully took up arms. 2 large armies were raised, the tribunes remonstrating to no purpose. Nausius led one against the Sabines. Having pitched his camp at Aretum, by small detachments, generally through nightly incursions, he effected such desolation in the Sabine land that, when compared to it, the Roman territories seemed untouched by an enemy. Minucius had neither the same success nor the same energy of mind in conducting his business. After pitching his camp not far from the enemy, without having experienced any considerable loss, he kept himself through fear within the camp. When the enemy perceived this, their boldness increased, as sometimes happens from others' fears. They attacked his camp by night, and when open force did not succeed well, they on the following day drew lines of circumvallation around it. Before these could close up all the passes, by a rampart being thrown up on all sides, 5 horsemen, dispatched between the enemy's posts, brought the account to Rome that the consul and his army were besieged. Nothing could have happened so unexpectedly, nor so unlooked for. Accordingly, the panic and alarm were as great as if the enemy besieged the city, not the camp. They sent for Consul Nausius. When he seemed to offer insufficient protection, and they determined that a dictator should be appointed to retrieve their embarrassed affairs, Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus was appointed by universal consent. Chapter 4. Cincinnatus, the ideal Roman leader. It is worth listening to those persons while to listen, who despise all things human in comparison with riches, and who suppose that there is no room for exalted honor, nor for virtue, unless riches abound in great profusion. Lucius Quintius, the sole hope of the Roman people, cultivated a farm of 4 acres on the other side of the Tiber, called the Quintian Meadows, opposite the very place where the dockyard now is. There, whether leaning on a stake in a ditch he was digging or plowing, engaged at least in some rural work, as is certain, after mutual salutations had passed, being requested by the ambassadors to put on his gown and listen to the commands of the Senate, with wishes that it might be happy both to him and to the Commonwealth. Being astonished and asking frequently whether all was safe, he bid his wife Ricilia immediately to bring his toga from his hut. As soon as he put this on and came forward, after first wiping off the dust and sweat, the ambassadors, congratulating him, united in saluting him as dictator. They called him into the city and explained to him the terror that now existed in the army. A vessel was prepared for Quintius by order of government, and his 3 sons, having come out to meet him, received him on his landing on the other side, then his other relatives and friends, then the greater part of the patricians. Accompanied by this numerous attendants, and the lictors going before him, he was conducted to his residence. There was a numerous concourse of the commons also, but they by no means looked on Quintius with equal pleasure, considering both the extent of his authority as too great and the man vested with such authority rather arbitrary. And during that night indeed nothing was done in the city besides posting guards. On the next day the dictator, having come into the forum before daylight, named a master of the horse, Lucius Tarquitius, a man of patrician family, but one who, though he had served his campaigns among the foot by reason of his scanty means, was yet considered by many degrees the first in military skill among the Roman youth. With his master of the horse, he came into the assembly, proclaimed a suspension of civil business, ordered the shops to be closed throughout the city, and forbade anyone to attend to any private affairs. Then he commanded that all who were of military age should attend under arms in the Campus Martius before sunset, with dress provisions for 5 days and 12 palisades. He also commanded that those whose age was too advanced for military service should prepare victuals for the soldiers in their vicinity, while the latter prepared arms and procured the palisades. Accordingly, the young men ran in different directions to procure the palisades. They took them wherever they were nearest. No one was prevented, and they all attended punctually according to the dictator's order. Then the troops being formed, no more fitted for the march than for an engagement, should the occasion require it, the dictator himself marched at the head of the legions, the master of the horse at the head of his cavalry. In both bodies there were such exhortations as the juncture itself required, that they should quicken their pace, that there was need of expedition, that they might reach the enemy by night, that the consul and the Romans were besieged, that they had been shut up now 3 days, that it was uncertain what each day or night might bring with it, that the issue of the most important affairs often depended on a moment of time. To please their leaders, they exclaimed among themselves, "Standard bearer, hasten on, follow, soldier." At midnight, they reached Algidum and, as soon as they perceived they were near the enemy, they halted. The dictator, having surveyed the camp by night to ascertain its layout, commanded the military tribunes to gather all baggage in one place. The soldiers, with their weapons and palisades, were to return to their ranks. This order was swiftly executed. Then, with disciplined precision, the entire army formed a long column and encircled the enemy's camp. The dictator gave instructions that, upon a signal, they should all raise a mighty shout. As the shout went up, each man was to dig a trench before his position and fix his palisade. The orders were issued, and the signal followed. The soldiers performed as commanded. The shout echoed around the enemy, passing beyond their camp and reaching the consul's forces. It caused panic in one place and great joy in another. The Romans, observing each other with exultation, recognized it as the shout of their countrymen, a sign that aid was at hand. From their watchguards and outposts, they in turn intimidated the enemy. The consul declared there could be no delay. The shout not only announced their arrival, but also signaled that action had already begun. He believed it likely that the enemy's camp was under outside attack. Therefore, he ordered his men to arm themselves and follow him. The battle was joined by the legions during the night. They notified the dictator with a shout that the fight had begun on their side as well. The equins, who had been preparing to prevent the encircling works, now turned their attention from the fortifications to the fighting within, lest a sally break through the center of their camp. They left the night uninterrupted for the completion of the dictator's work, and the battle with the consul continued until daylight. At dawn, the equins found themselves encompassed by the dictator's fortifications. They were barely able to maintain the fight against one army. Then, their lines were attacked by Quintius's army, which had returned to arms immediately after completing their work. A new fight pressed upon them, the former having known no relaxation. With twofold peril bearing down, they ceased fighting and turned to entreaties. They implored both the dictator and the consul not to make the victory a general slaughter, asking only to be allowed to depart without arms. The consul directed them to the dictator. The dictator, incensed, added ignominy to their defeat. He ordered Gracchus Cloelius, their general, and other leaders to be brought to him in chains. He demanded they evacuate the town of Corbio, stating he did not seek the blood of the equins. They were permitted to leave, but only after a confession was wrung from them, that their nation was defeated and subdued, and that they must pass under the yoke. The yoke was formed with 3 spears, 2 fixed in the ground, and 1 tied across between their upper ends. Under this yoke, the dictator sent the equins. The enemy's camp, rich with provisions, was taken. The dictator, having sent the equins away naked, distributed all the booty among his own soldiers only. Chiding the consul's army and the consul himself, he declared, "Soldiers, you shall receive no portion of the spoils from an enemy to whom you were nearly spoiling yourselves. And you, Lucius Minucius, until you begin to assume the spirit of a consul, shall command these legions as lieutenant general." Minucius accordingly resigned his office of consul and remained with the army as commanded. Such was the meek obedience of men at that time to authority combined with superior merit, that this army, mindful more of the kindness conferred than the slur cast upon them, voted a golden crown of £1 weight to the dictator and saluted him as their patron upon his departure. The Senate at Rome, convened by Quintus Fabius, the city prefect, ordered Quintius to enter the city in triumph, in the same marching order as he arrived. The enemy leaders were led before his chariot. Military standards were carried ahead, and his army followed, laden with spoils. Tables laden with provisions are said to have been laid out before every house, and the soldiers, partaking of the entertainment, followed the chariot with triumphal hymns and the usual jests like revelers. On that day, The freedom of the state was granted to Lucius Mamilius of Tusculum, with universal approbation. The dictator would have laid down his office, had not the assembly for the trial of Marcus Volscius, the false witness, detained him. The fear of the dictator prevented the tribunes from obstructing it. Volscius was condemned and went into exile to Lanuvium. Quintius laid down his dictatorship on the 16th day, having held it for 6 months. During those days, Consul Nautius engaged the Sabines at Aretum with distinguished success. In addition to the devastation of their lands, this additional blow also befell the Sabines. Fabius Quintus was sent to Algidum as successor to Minucius. Towards the end of the year, the tribunes began to agitate the question of the law, but because 2 armies were abroad, the patricians carried the point that no business should be proposed to the people. The commons succeeded in electing the same tribunes for the 5th time. They reported that wolves seen in the capital were driven away by dogs, and that on account of that prodigy, the capital was purified. Such were the transactions of that year. Chapter 5. The creation of the Decemvirs. Quintus Minucius and Caius Horatius Pulvillus followed as the next consuls. At the commencement of this year, with peace abroad, the same tribunes and the same law caused disturbances at home. Parties would have proceeded further, so highly inflamed were their passions, had not news been brought, as if by design, that the Equins had attacked and cut off the garrison at Corbio. The consuls convened the Senate and were ordered to raise a hasty levy and proceed to Algidum. Then, the contest over the law was set aside, and a new dispute arose regarding the levy. Consular authority was about to be overpowered by tribunician influence when an additional cause of alarm emerged. The Sabine army had descended into Roman lands to commit depredations and was advancing toward the city. This fear influenced the tribunes to allow the levy to proceed, though not without a stipulation. Since they had been foiled for 5 years, and as that offered little protection to the commons, 10 tribunes of the people should henceforth be elected. Necessity wrung this from the patricians, with the sole exception that they should not re-elect the same tribunes in the future. The election for the tribunes was held immediately, lest that measure also, like others, might prove a delusion after the war. In the 36th year after the first tribunes, 10 were elected, 2 from each class, and provision was made that they should be elected in this manner for the future. The levy then being held, Minucius marched against the Sabines but found no enemy. Horatius, after the Equins had put the garrison at Corbio to the sword and taken Ortona, fought a battle at Algidum. He slew a great number, driving the enemy not only from Algidum, but also from Corbio and Ortona. He razed Corbio to the ground for their betrayal of the garrison. Marcus Valerius and Spurius Verginius were the next elected consuls. Quiet prevailed at home and abroad. They suffered a scarcity of provisions due to excessive rains. A law was proposed regarding the making of Mount Aventine public property. The same tribunes of the people, re-elected the following year under the consulship of Titus Romilius and Caius Veturius, strongly recommended the law in all their harangues. They declared themselves ashamed of their uselessly increased numbers if that question should remain unresolved for 2 more years, as it had for the preceding 5. While they were most busily engaged in these matters, an alarming account arrived from Tusculum. The Equins were in Tusculan territory. The recent services of that state made them ashamed of delaying relief. Both consuls were sent with an army and found the enemy in their usual post in Algidum. A battle was fought there. Upwards of 7,000 of the enemy were slain, and the rest routed. Immense booty was obtained. The consuls sold this due to the low state of the treasury, a proceeding that caused dissatisfaction among the army, and also provided the tribunes with material to bring a charge against the consuls before the commons. Accordingly, as soon as they left office, during the consulship of Spurius Tarpius and Aulus Atirius, a day was appointed for Romilius by Caius Claudius Cicero, tribune of the people, and for Veturius by Lucius Aelianus, plebeian aedile. Both were condemned, to the great mortification of the patricians, Romilius to pay 10,000 asses, Veturius 15,000. Nor did this misfortune of their predecessors render the new consuls more remiss. They maintained that they too might be condemned, and that the commons and tribunes could not carry the law. Then, casting aside the law, which had grown old in its repeated publication, the tribunes adopted a milder mode of proceeding with the patricians. They proposed an end to their disputes. If plebeian laws displeased them, they should at least permit legislators chosen in common, from both the commons and the patricians, who would propose measures advantageous to both parties and tending to the equalization of liberty. The patricians did not reject this proposal. They stipulated, however, that no one should propose laws except some of the patricians. When they agreed on the laws but differed only on the proposer, ambassadors were sent to Athens. Spurius Posthumius Albus, Aulus Manlius, and Publius Sulpicius Camerinus. They were ordered to copy out the celebrated laws of Solon and to become acquainted with the institutions, customs, and laws of the other states of Greece. The year was undisturbed by foreign wars. The following year was even more quiet, with Publius Curiatius and Sextus Quintilius as consuls. The tribunes observed uninterrupted silence, occasioned first by their waiting for the ambassadors who had gone to Athens and for the foreign laws. Secondly, two heavy calamities arose simultaneously: famine and pestilence, destructive to both man and cattle. The lands were left desolate, the city exhausted by a constant succession of deaths. Many illustrious families were in mourning. The Flamen Quirinalis, Servilius Cornelius, died, as did the augur, Caius Horatius Pulvillus. Into his place, the augurs elected Caius Veturius, the more eagerly because he had been condemned by the commons. The consul Quintilius died, and 4 tribunes of the people. The year was rendered a melancholy one by these manifold disasters, but from an enemy there was perfect quiet. Then Caius Menenius and Publius Cestius Capitolinus were elected consuls. Nor was there any external war that year. Disturbances arose at home. The ambassadors had now returned with the Athenian laws, and the tribunes pressed more urgently for the compilation of the laws to finally begin. It was resolved that decemvirs should be elected without appeal, and that there should be no other magistrate during that year. For a considerable time, there was a dispute over whether plebeians should be admitted among them. At length, the point was conceded to the patricians, provided that the Icilian law regarding the Aventine and the other devoting laws were not repealed. In the 301st years after Rome was built, the form of government was changed a second time. Supreme power was transferred from consuls to decemvirs, just as it had previously passed from kings to consuls. The change was less remarkable because it was not long-lasting, for the joyous commencement of that government became too licentious. So much the sooner the system failed, and the practice was reverted to, that the name and authority of consuls was committed to 2 persons. The appointed decemvirs were Appius Claudius, Titus Genutius, Publius Cestius, Lucius Veturius, Caius Julius, Aulus Manlius, Servius Sulpicius, Publius Curiatius, Titus Romilius, and Spurius Postumius. Claudius and Genutius, having been elected consuls for that year, received the honor as compensation. Cestius, one of the consuls of the previous year, was honored for proposing the matter to the Senate against his colleague's will. Next, the 3 ambassadors who had gone to Athens were considered, both as a recompense for their distant embassy, and because their knowledge of foreign laws would be useful in digesting the new code of regulations. Other individuals completed the number. It is said that older persons were appointed by the last suffrages, so that they might oppose the opinions of others with less warmth. The direction of the entire government rested with Appius, through the favor of the commons. He had assumed a new demeanor, transforming from a severe and harsh critic of the people into a sudden protector of the commons and a candidate for popular favor. They administered justice to the people one every 10th day. On that day, 12 fasces attended the prefect of justice, and 1 beadle attended each of his 9 colleagues. In their singular harmony, which unanimity could sometimes prove prejudicial to private persons, the strictest equity was shown to others. It will suffice to adduce one proof of their moderation. Though they had been appointed without the privilege of appeal, Yet when a dead body was found buried in the house of Publius Cestius, a man of patrician rank, and this was brought forward in an assembly, a matter equally clear and atrocious, Caius Julius, a Decemvir, appointed a day of trial for Cestius. He appeared before the people as prosecutor in a matter of which he was legally a judge, relinquishing his right, so that he might add what had been taken from the power of the office to the liberty of the people. While the highest and lowest alike experienced prompt and impartial justice from them, as if from an oracle, their attention then turned to the framing of laws. The 10 tables were proposed amid intense public expectation. They summoned the people to an assembly and, for the benefit and happiness of the commonwealth and their children, ordered them to read the exhibited laws. They proclaimed that they had equalized the rights of all, as far as the abilities of 10 men could devise. They suggested that the understanding and counsel of a greater number might prove more successful. They urged everyone to consider each particular, discuss it in conversation, and bring any perceived excess or deficiency under public discussion. The Roman people, they stated, should have laws that general consent had not merely ratified when proposed, but had, in fact, proposed themselves. When these laws appeared sufficiently corrected according to public opinion on each published chapter, the laws of the 10 tables were passed at the assembly voting by centuries. Even today, amidst the immense heap of laws crowded one upon another, these tables remain the source of all public and private jurisprudence. A rumor then spread that 2 tables were missing. With their addition, a complete body of Roman law might be formed. The expectation of this, as the election day approached, created a desire to appoint decemvirs again. The commons, besides detesting the name of consuls as much as kings, now felt no need for tribunician aid, as the decemvirs, in turn, submitted to appeal. But when the assembly for electing decemvirs was proclaimed for the 3rd market day, a strong flame of ambition blazed forth. The state's leading men began to canvass individuals, perhaps fearing that such high authority might become accessible to unworthy persons if left unoccupied by themselves. They humbly solicited an honor they had once opposed with all their might from the very commons with whom they had so often contended. Their dignity, now lowered to the risk of a contest at such an age, and after having held such honors, stimulated the exertions of Appius Claudius. One could not tell whether to count him among the decemvirs or the candidates. He resembled more closely one canvassing for office than one already invested with it. He disparaged the nobility, extolled every insignificant and humble candidate. Surrounded by the Duilii and Icilii, who had been tribunes, he bustled about the forum. Through their means, he recommended himself to the commons. Even his colleagues, who until then had been extremely devoted to him, now watched him with wonder, questioning his intentions. It was evident to them that there was no sincerity in his actions. Such affability amid such pride, they concluded, would surely not be without purpose. This excessive lowering of himself, this leveling with private citizens, was not the conduct of one hastening to leave office, but rather of one seeking to perpetuate it. Not daring to openly oppose his wishes, they sought to baffle his ardor by humoring it. By common consent, they conferred upon him, as the youngest, the office of presiding at the elections. This was an artifice to prevent him from appointing himself, a practice no one had ever done except the tribunes of the people, and that with the very worst precedent. He, however, declaring that with the favor of fortune he would preside at the elections, seized on the intended obstacle as a happy occasion. By a coalition, he foiled the 2 Quincii, Capitolinus and Cincinnatus, and his own uncle, Caius Claudius, a man most steadfast in the interest of the nobility, and other citizens of similar eminence. He was then appointed as decemvirs men by no means equal in rank. He appointed himself first, preceding honorable men disapproved of all the more, as no one had imagined he would dare to act so. With him were elected Marcus Cornelius Melogenensis, Marcus Sergius, Lucius Minucius, Quintus Fabius Vibulanus, Quintus Poetetlius, Titus Antonius Merenda, Ciso Duilius, Spurius Appius Cornicen, and Manius Rabulius. Chapter 6. The 12 Tables. This was the end of Appius's assumption of a character not his own. Henceforward, he began to live according to his natural disposition and to mold his new colleagues to his own temper before they should enter their office. They held daily meetings remote from witnesses. Then, furnished with their schemes of tyranny, which they devised privately, no longer dissembling their arrogance, they became difficult to access, morose to all who addressed them. They carried out their plans to the Ides of May. The Ides of May were at that time the usual period for commencing office. At the start of their magistracy, they made the first day of their office remarkable by an exhibition of great terror. Whereas the preceding Decemvirs had observed the rule that only one should have the fasces, and that this emblem of royalty should pass through all in rotation, each in his turn, these new Decemvirs all suddenly came forth with 12 fasces. 120 lictors filled the forum, carrying before them axes tied up with the fasces. They explained that it was of no consequence that the axe should be taken away, as they had been appointed without the privilege of appeal. There was the appearance of 10 kings, and terrors multiplied not only for the humblest individuals, but even for the principal patricians. They believed that a pretext and a commencement of bloodshed were being sought. If anyone should utter a word favorable to liberty, either in the Senate or in a meeting of the people, rods and axes would be instantly brought forward to intimidate the rest. Besides, there was no protection for the people, the right of appeal being abolished. They had also by mutual consent prohibited interference with each other. The preceding Decemvirs, in contrast, had allowed their decided points of law to be amended by appeal to a colleague, and had referred to the people some points that might seem to come within their own jurisdiction. For a considerable time, the terror seemed equalized among all ranks. Gradually, it began to turn entirely on the commons. They spared the patricians. Arbitrary and cruel treatment was shown to the humbler classes. They were entirely respectful of the person, not of the cause, as if interest usurped the force of justice. Their decisions they concerted at home and pronounced in the forum. If any person appealed to a colleague, he left the one to whom he had appealed in such a manner as to regret not having abided by the sentence of the former. An opinion also spread, without authority, that they had conspired in their tyranny not only for the present time, but that a clandestine league had been struck among them, with an oath that they would not hold the comitia, and that by perpetuating the decemvirate, they would retain the power they now possessed. The plebeians then began to watch the countenances of the patricians closely, hoping to catch the breeze of liberty from that quarter, from which, by apprehending slavery, they had brought the republic into its present condition. The leading members of the Senate detested the Decemvirs and detested the commons. They neither approved of what was going on, and they considered that what befell the latter was not without their deserving it. They were unwilling to assist men who, by rushing too eagerly towards liberty, had fallen into slavery. They even heaped injuries on them, so that, from their disgust at the present state of things, 2 consuls and the former mode of government might at length become desirable. The greater part of the year had now passed, and 2 tables of laws had been added to the 10 tables of the former year. If these laws also were once passed in an assembly of the centuries, there would remain no reason for the Republic to require that form of government. They were anxiously waiting to see how soon the assembly would be proclaimed for the election of consuls. The commons were only devising by what means they would re-establish the tribunician power, that bulwark of their liberty, a thing now so long discontinued. In the meantime, no mention was made of the elections. The Decemvirs, who had at first exhibited themselves to the people surrounded by men of tribunician rank, because that was deemed popular, now guarded themselves by collecting young patricians. Troops of these beset the tribunals. These seized and drove about the commons and their effects, with success attending the more powerful individual in obtaining whatever he coveted. And now they spared not even their backs. Some were beaten with rods, others had to submit to the axe. Lest such cruelty might go for nothing, a grant of his effects followed the punishment of the owner. Corrupted by such bribes, the young nobility not only made no opposition to oppression, but openly avowed their preference for their own gratification over the general liberty. The Ides of May came. With no new election of magistrates having taken place, private persons came forth as decemvirs, without any abatement either in their determination to enforce their authority or any diminution in the emblems used to parade their station. This indeed seemed to be regal tyranny. Liberty was now deplored as lost forever, nor did any champion stand forth or appear likely to do so. And not only they themselves sank into despondency, but they began to be looked down upon by the neighboring states, who felt indignant that dominion should exist where liberty was lost. The Sabines, with a numerous body of men, made an incursion on Roman territory. Having committed extensive devastations, after driving off booty of men and cattle with impunity, they recalled their troops, which had been dispersed in different directions, to Aretum and pitched their camp there. They grounded their hopes on the dissensions at Rome, trusting that these would obstruct the levy. Not only the couriers, but the flight of the country people through the city caused alarm. The decemvirs consulted on what should be done. While they were thus left destitute between the hatred of the patricians and the people, fortune added another cause of alarm. The equins on the opposite side pitched their camp at Algidum. Ambassadors from Tusculum, imploring relief, brought accounts that the Tusculan land was ravaged by detachments from there. The panic this occasioned urged the decemvirs to consult the Senate, as two wars at the same time surrounded the city. They ordered the patricians to be summoned into the Senate house, well aware of the storm of resentment ready to break upon them. All would heap upon them the causes of the laid waste land and the dangers threatening them. This would occasion an attempt to abolish their office if they did not unite in resisting and, by enforcing their authority with severity on a few intractable spirits, repress the efforts of others. When the voice of the crier summoning the senators into the Senate house before the decemvirs was heard in the forum, it attracted the attention of the people as an altogether new matter. They expressed surprise that, after so long an interval, they should revive a practice now discontinued. They reasoned that they had cause to thank the enemy in war for anything being done that used to be done when their state was free. They looked around for a senator through all parts of the forum, and seldom recognized one anywhere. They then directed their attention to the Senate house and to the solitude around the decemvirs. While they themselves attributed the non-assembling of the patricians to their universally detested government, the commons believed the cause of the non-assembling was that, being but private citizens, the decemvirs had no right to convene the Senate. A head was now formed of those who would demand back their liberty, if the commons would but accompany the Senate. And as the patricians, when summoned, did not attend the Senate, so the commons also should refuse to enlist. Such were the remarks of the commons. There were scarcely any of the patricians in the forum, and very few in the city. Disgusted with the state of affairs, they had retired into the country and were attending to their own affairs, renouncing all public concerns, considering that they themselves were aloof from ill-treatment in proportion as they should remove themselves from the meeting and converse with their imperious masters. When those who had been summoned did not assemble, apparitors were dispatched to their houses, both to levy the penalties and to ascertain whether they declined attendance through design. They brought back word that the Senate was in the country. This was more pleasing to the decemvirs than if they had reported that they were present and refused obedience to their commands. They commanded them all to be sent for and proclaimed a meeting of the Senate for the following day, which congregated in much greater numbers than they themselves had expected. By this proceeding, the commons considered that their liberty was betrayed by the patricians, because the Senate had obeyed those persons, as if they had a right to compel them, who had already gone out of office and were but private individuals, were it not for the violence they employed. However, they showed more obedience in coming into the Senate than servility in the sentiments they expressed, as we have learned. It is recorded that, after Appius stated the subject of the meeting, and before opinions were demanded in order, Lucius Valerius Potitus caused a commotion. He demanded permission to express his sentiments concerning the state, and when the decemvirs threatened him, he declared he would present himself before the people. We have also heard that Marcus Horatius Barbatus entered the lists with no less boldness, calling them 10 Tarquins. He reminded them that, under the leadership of the Valeri and Horatii, kings had been expelled. It was not merely the name that men were tired of, he argued, a name used to style Jupiter, Romulus the city's founder, and his successors, a name even retained in solemn religious ceremonies. Rather, it was the tyranny and arrogance of a king they detested. If such traits were not tolerated in one who was both a king himself and the son of a king, who was to tolerate them in so many private citizens? He warned them to beware lest, by preventing free speech in the Senate, they might oblige senators to raise their voices outside the Senate House. He saw no reason why it was less allowable for him, a private citizen, to summon the people to an assembly than for them to convene the Senate. They might try, whenever they pleased, how much more determined a sense of wrong would be in vindicating one's own liberty than ambition in upholding usurped domination. He asserted that they proposed the question concerning the Sabine War, as if the Roman people had any more important war at hand than that against those who, elected to frame laws, had left no law in the state. They had abolished elections, annual magistrates, and the regular change of rulers, which was the only means of equalizing liberty. These men, though private citizens, still possessed the fasces and regal dominion. He pointed out that upon the expulsion of the kings, patrician magistrates were appointed, and subsequently, after the secession of the people, plebeian magistrates. To which party, he asked, did they belong? To the popular party? What had they ever done with the concurrence of the people? Were they nobles, who, for nearly an entire year, had not held a meeting of the Senate, and now held one in such a manner that they actually prevented numbers from expressing their sentiments regarding the Commonwealth? He warned them not to place too much hope in the fears of others, as the grievances they were suffering now appeared more oppressive than any they might have to apprehend. While Horatius was exclaiming in this manner, and the Decemvirs could not discover any limit either to their anger or forbearance, nor could they see to what the situation would lead, Caius Claudius, uncle to Appius the Decemvir, delivered an address more like entreaties than reproach. He beseeched him, by the shade of his own brother and father, to remember the civil society in which he was born, rather than the nefarious confederacy entered into with his colleagues. He emphasized that he bought this much more for Appius's own sake than for the Commonwealth. For the Commonwealth, he asserted, would assert its rights in spite of them, if it could not obtain them with their consent. But from great contests, great animosities arise, the result of which he dreaded. Though the Decemvirs forbade them to speak on any other subject than that which they had submitted, they felt too much respect for Claudius to interrupt him. He therefore concluded his address by moving that it was their wish that no decree of the Senate should be passed. All understood the matter thus, that they were judged by Claudius to be private citizens. Many men of consular standing expressed their assent. Another measure proposed, more harsh in appearance, possessed much less efficacy. It ordered the patricians to assemble to elect an interrex. By passing any resolution, they judged that those persons who convened the Senate were magistrates of some kind or other. In contrast, the person who recommended that no decree of the Senate should be passed had thereby declared them private citizens. When the cause of the Decemvirs was now faltering, Lucius Cornelius Meluginensis, brother of Marcus Cornelius the Decemvir, who had been purposely reserved from among the consular men to close the debate, defended his brother and his colleagues by affecting anxiety about the war. He stated he wondered by what fatality had occurred that those who had been candidates for the decemvirate should attack the Decemvirs, either as secondaries or as principals. Or, when no one disputed for so many months while the state was disengaged whether legal magistrates had the management of affairs, why did they now sow discord when the enemies were nearly at the gate, unless that in a state of confusion, they thought their aim would be less seen through? He argued that it was not just that anyone should prejudice so important a cause while their minds were occupied with a more momentous concern. It was his opinion that the point Valerius and Horatius urged, namely that the Decemvirs had gone out of office before the Ides of May, should be discussed in the Senate when the impending wars were over and the Commonwealth had been restored to tranquility. He added that Appius Claudius should now prepare to take notice that an account was to be rendered by him of the comitia, which he himself held for electing Decemvirs, whether they were elected for 1 year or until the laws that were wanted were ratified. It was his opinion that all other matters should be laid aside for the present, except the war. If they thought the reports regarding it were propagated without foundation, and that not only the couriers but also the ambassadors of the Tusculans had stated what was false, he thought scouts should be dispatched to bring back more certain information. But if credit were given to both the couriers and the ambassadors, then the levy should be held at the very earliest opportunity. The Decemvirs should lead the armies wherever it seemed proper to each, and no other matter should take precedence. The junior patricians succeeded in having this opinion carried. Valerius and Horatius, rising again with greater vehemence, demanded aloud that they be allowed to express their sentiments concerning the Republic. They declared they would address the people if, by a faction, they were not allowed to do so in the Senate. For private individuals, either in the Senate or in a General Assembly, could not prevent them, nor would they yield to their imaginary faces. Appius, then considering that the crisis was now nigh at hand, when their authority would be overpowered unless their violence were resisted with equal boldness, said, "It will be better not to utter a word on any subject except that which we are now considering." And to Valerius, when he refused to be silent for a private individual, he commanded a lictor to proceed. When Valerius, on the threshold of the Senate house, craved the protection of the citizens, Lucius Cornelius, embracing Appius, put an end to the dispute, not consulting the interest of his interest. With permission to speak his sentiments obtained for Valerius through Cornelius, when this liberty did not extend beyond words, the Decemvirs achieved their objective. The consulars and senior members, from the hatred of tribunician power still rankling in their bosoms, the desire of which they considered was much more keenly felt by the commons than that of the consular power, almost would rather that the Decemvirs themselves should voluntarily resign their office at some future period than that the people should rise once more into consequence through their unpopularity. If the matter, conducted with gentleness, should again return to the consuls without popular turbulence, the commons might be induced to forget their tribunes, either by the intervention of wars or by the moderation of the consuls in exercising their authority. A levy was proclaimed amid the silence of the patricians. The young men answered to their names, as the government was without appeal. The legions being enrolled, the Decemvirs set about arranging among themselves who should set out to war and who should command the armies. The leading men among the Decemvirs were Quintus Fabius and Appius Claudius. There appeared a more serious war at home than abroad. They considered the violence of Appius better suited to suppress commotions in the city, while Fabius possessed a disposition rather inconstant in good pursuits than strenuous in bad ones. For this man, formerly distinguished at home and abroad, his office of Decemvir and his colleagues had so changed that he chose rather to be like Appius than like himself. To him, the war against the Sabines was committed, his colleagues, Manius Rabulius and Quintus Poetetlius, being sent with him. Marcus Cornelius was sent to Algidum with Lucius Minucius and Titus Antonius, and Ciso Duilius and Marcus Sergius. They appointed Spurius Oppius as an assistant to Appius Claudius to protect the city, their authority being equal to that of all the Decemvirs. The Republic was managed with no better success in war than at home. In this, the only fault in the generals was that they had rendered themselves objects of hatred to their fellow citizens. In other respects, the whole fault lay with the soldiers. They, lest any enterprise should succeed under the conduct and auspices of the Decemvirs, suffered themselves to be beaten, to their own disgrace and that of their generals. Their armies were routed by the Sabines at Aretum and in Algidum by the Equins. Having fled from Aretum during the silence of the night, they fortified their camp nearer to the city, on an elevated situation between Fidene and Crustamiria. Nowhere encountered the enemy, who pursued them, on equal ground. They protected themselves by the nature of the place and a rampart, not by valor or arms. Greater disgrace and greater loss were sustained in Algidum. Their camp also was lost, and the soldiers, stripped of all their utensils, betook themselves to Tusculum, determined to procure the means of subsistence from the good faith and compassion of their hosts, which, however, did not disappoint them. Such alarming accounts were brought to Rome that the patricians, having laid aside their hatred of the Decemvirs, passed an order that watches should be held in the city. They commanded that all who were able by reason of their age to carry arms should mount guard on the walls and form outposts before the gates. They also voted arms to be sent to Tusculum, besides a reinforcement. They ordered that the Decemvirs also should come down from the citadel of Tusculum and keep their troops encamped, that the other camp should be removed from Fidene into the Sabine territory, and that the enemy might be deterred, by thus attacking them first, from entertaining any intentions of attacking the city. To the calamities received from the enemy, the Decemvirs added two flagitious deeds, one abroad and the other in the city. In the Sabine district, Lucius Cixius, who, during the unpopularity of the Decemvirs, had secretly discussed with common soldiers the election of tribunes and a secession, was sent forward to select a place for a camp. Instructions were given to the soldiers accompanying him on that expedition to attack him in a convenient place and slay him. They did not kill him with impunity, for several of the assassins fell around him resisting. Possessing great personal strength and courage equal to that strength, he defended himself while surrounded. The rest brought an account into the camp that Cixius, fighting bravely, had fallen into an ambush, and that some soldiers were lost with him. At first, the narrators believed. Afterwards, a cohort, which went by permission of the Decemvirs to bury those who had fallen, observed that none of the bodies there were stripped, that Cixius lay in the middle with his arms, all the bodies being turned towards him, while there was neither any body of the enemy, nor even any traces of them leaving. They brought back his body, saying that he had certainly been slain by his own men. The camp was now filled with indignation, and it was being determined that Cixius should be forthwith brought to Rome, had not the Decemvirs hastened to perform a military funeral for him at public expense. He was buried amid the great grief of the soldiery, and with the worst possible reputation of the Decemvirs among the common people. Chapter 7. The Second Secession. Another dreadful act unfolded in the city, born of lust, with consequences as tragic as the event that expelled the Tarquins from Rome. This deed, which mirrored the violation and death of Lucretia, led to the Decemvirs' downfall, with the same cause that had ended the king's reign. Appius Claudius was consumed by a criminal desire for a young woman of plebeian birth. Her father, Lucius Verginius, was a centurion of honorable standing at Algidum, a man of exemplary conduct both at home and in military service. His wife and children were raised with similar virtue. His daughter was betrothed to Lucius Icilius, a former tribune known for his spirit and dedication to the people's interests. This young woman, in the bloom of youth and renowned for her beauty, became the object of Appius's fervent desire. He attempted to seduce her with bribes and promises. When he found modesty barred all avenues to possession, he resorted to cruel and tyrannical force. He instructed Marcus Claudius, a dependent, to claim the girl as his slave and to resist anyone who might demand her temporary freedom. Appius believed the girl's father's absence provided an opportunity for this injustice. The instrument of the Decemvirs' lust seized the girl as she entered the forum, where literary schools were held. Calling her the daughter of his slave and a slave herself, he commanded her to follow him, threatening to use force if she resisted. The girl was stunned with terror. Her nurse's cries for help drew a crowd. The names of her father, Verginius, and her betrothed, Icilius, were on everyone's lips. Their reputation swayed acquaintances, while the heinousness of the act moved the wider crowd. She was momentarily safe from violence when the claimant declared, "There is no need to raise a mob. I am proceeding by law, not by force." He summoned the girl to court. Those supporting her advised her to follow, and they arrived at Appius's tribunal. The claimant then recounted a prearranged farce familiar to the judge, who was the plot's architect. He asserted that a girl born in his house, clandestinely transferred to Verginius's home, had been falsely attributed to the latter. He claimed this was verified by certain evidence and promised to prove it, even to Verginius himself, who would suffer the greatest loss. He concluded that it was only just for the girl to accompany her master in the interim. Verginia's advocates argued that Verginius was absent on state business and would return in 2 days if sent for. They maintained it was unjust for him to risk his children's fate in his absence. They demanded that the matter be adjourned until the father's arrival, and that the girl be granted interim liberty, according to the law Appius himself had passed. They insisted that a maiden of ripe age should not risk her reputation before her freedom. Appius began his decree by stating that the very law cited by Verginius's friends showed his favor towards liberty. However, he argued that liberty would be protected only if the law applied consistently to all cases and persons. He explained that for individuals claimed as free, the law allowed anyone to act on their behalf. But for a girl in her father's custody, no one else could compel a master to relinquish his claim. Therefore, Appius declared that Verginius should be sent for. In the interim, the claimant would suffer no loss of his right, and the girl should accompany him, with a promise to produce her upon the arrival of her so-called father. Many murmured against the injustice of this decision, but no one dared to protest individually. Then the girl's uncle, Publius Numitorius, and her betrothed Icilius arrived. As they made their way through the crowd, the multitude believed that Icilius's intervention might most effectively resist Appius. The lictor, however, declared that he had decided the matter and removed Icilius when he attempted to speak. Such atrocious injustice would have inflamed even a calm temper. "By the sword, Appius," Icilius exclaimed, "I must be removed from here for you to silently accomplish what you wish to conceal. This young woman I am to marry. I am determined to have a lawful and chaste wife. Therefore, call all the lictors of your colleagues, order the rods and axes to be ready. The betrothed wife of Icilius shall not remain outside her father's house. Though you have stripped us of the aid of our tribunes and the power of appeal to the Roman commoners, our 2 bulwarks of liberty, you have not been granted absolute dominion over our wives and children. Vent your fury on our backs and necks, but let chastity at least be secure. If violence is offered to her, I shall implore the protection of the citizens present on behalf of my betrothed. Verginius will implore that of the soldiers on behalf of his only daughter. We shall all implore the protection of gods and men, and you shall not carry out that sentence without our blood. I demand of you, Appius, consider again and again the lengths to which you are proceeding. Let Verginius, when he comes, consider what conduct he should pursue with respect to his daughter. Let him only be assured of this. If he yields to this man's claims, he will have to find another match for his daughter. As for my part, in vindicating my betrothed's liberty, life shall leave me sooner than my honor." The multitude was now agitated, and a conflict seemed imminent. The lictors surrounded Icilius, though they went no further than threats. Appius then stated that it was not Verginia that Icilius defended, but that, being a restless man, still breathing the spirit of the tribuneship, he sought an occasion for disturbance. He would not provide him with material that day. But, so that Icilius might understand that the concession was made not to his petulance, but to the absent Verginius, to the name of father and to liberty, he would not decide the case that day, nor issue a decree. He would request Marcus Claudius to forego some of his rights, and allow the girl to be bailed until the next day. However, if the father did not attend on the following day, he warned Icilius, and those like him, that neither the law's founder would betray his own law, nor would the decemvir lack firmness. Nor would he gather the lictors of his colleagues to suppress promoters of sedition. He would be content with his own lictors. With the deferral of this injustice, the maiden's friends withdrew. It was decided that Icilius's brother and Numitorius's son, both energetic young men, should immediately go to the gate and bring Verginius from the camp with all possible haste. The girl's safety depended on his timely presence the next day as her protector. They followed instructions and swiftly delivered the news to her father. When the maiden's claimant pressed Icilius to become the defendant and provide sureties, Icilius, deliberately prolonging the time until the messengers reached the camp, said he was doing just that. The multitude raised their hands, with everyone offering to stand surety for Icilius. With tears in his eyes, Icilius replied, "It is very kind of you. Tomorrow I will avail myself of your assistance. At present, I have sufficient sureties." Thus, Verginia was bailed on the security of her relatives. Appius delayed a short time, so as not to appear to have deliberated solely on this case. When no one else came forward, and all other matters were abandoned due to the general anxiety, he went home. He wrote to his colleagues in the camp, instructing them not to grant leave of absence to Verginius, and even to keep him in confinement. This wicked scheme was deservedly too late. Verginius had already obtained his leave and set out at the first watch, making the letter regarding his detention useless when delivered the following morning. In the city, citizens stood in the forum, filled with expectation. At daybreak, Verginius, clad in mourning, led his daughter, also in somber attire, accompanied by some matrons and a considerable body of advocates, into the forum. He began to circulate, soliciting individuals. He not only entreated their aid as a favor, but demanded it as his due. He stood daily on the field of battle in defense of their children and wives, he declared, and no other man could claim a greater number of brave and intrepid deeds in war. What availed it if, while the city remained secure, their children were exposed to the same harsh treatment that would be feared if it were captured? Delivering these observations as if addressing an assembly, he solicited them individually. Icilius used similar arguments. The female attendants had a greater effect with their silent tears than any words. With a mind utterly insensible to all this, such was the paroxysm of madness, rather than love, that had perverted his mind, Appius ascended the tribunal. When the claimant briefly began to complain that justice had been denied him the previous day due to a desire to please the people, Appius interrupted him before he could finish his claim or Verginius could reply. Ancient authors may have truthfully recorded the preamble to Appius's sentence. "Because I find no suitable one for such a scandalous business, it seems that the naked fact should be stated as agreed." He passed a sentence consigning her to slavery. At first, everyone was astounded by the heinousness of the proceeding. Then, silence prevailed for some time. When Marcus Claudius proceeded to seize the maiden, surrounded by matrons, and was met with the piteous lamentation of the women, Verginius, menacingly extending his hands towards Appius, declared, "To Icilius, and not to you, Appius, have I betrothed my daughter, and for matrimony, not prostitution, have I brought her up. Do you wish men to gratify their lust promiscuously, like cattle and wild beasts? Whether these persons will endure such things, I know not. I hope that those who have arms in their hands will not." When the girl's claimant was repulsed by the crowd of women and advocates surrounding her, silence was commanded by the crier. The decemvir, his mind consumed by lust, declared that not only from Icilius's abusive language and Verginius's violence yesterday, witnessed by all Rome, but also from authentic information, he knew that cabals had been held in the city all night to incite sedition. Therefore, aware of the danger, he had come with armed soldiers, not to molest peaceful citizens, but to punish those disturbing the state's tranquility in a manner befitting the government's majesty. "It will be better to remain quiet," he commanded. "Go, lictor, remove the crowd and make way for the master to seize his slave." When Appius thundered these words, bursting with passion, the multitude voluntarily parted, and the girl stood deserted, a prey to injustice. Then Verginius, seeing no aid anywhere, pleaded, "I beg you, Appius, first, pardon a father's grief if I have said anything too harsh against you. Next, allow me to question the nurse before the maiden, to understand this matter, so that if I have been falsely called her father, I may depart with a more resigned mind." Permission granted, he drew the girl and the nurse aside to the sheds near the temple of Cloacina, now called the New Sheds. There, snatching a knife from a butcher, he declared, "In this one way, the only one in my power, do I secure your liberty." He then plunged the knife into the girl's breast. Looking back towards the tribunal, he cried, "With this blood I devote thee, Appius, and thy head." Appius, roused by the cry from such a dreadful deed, ordered Verginius seized. Verginius, armed with the knife, cleared a path wherever he went, protected by the accompanying crowd, until he reached the gate. Icilius and Numitorius took up the lifeless body and displayed it to the people. They deplored Appius's villainy, the maiden's tragic beauty, and the father's dire necessity. The matrons who followed exclaimed, "Was this the condition of raising children? Were these the rewards of chastity?" And other lamentations that female grief suggests on such occasions, their complaints all the more affecting due to the intense natural tenderness of their minds. The men's voices, especially Icilius's, focused entirely on the lost tribunician power, the right of appeal to the people that had been taken, and the indignities inflicted upon the state. The multitude was agitated partly by the atrocious nature of the deed, partly by the hope of regaining their liberty through this opportune moment. Appius ordered Icilius to be summoned, and when he refused to come, to be seized. Finally, when his attendants could not reach Icilius, Appius himself, proceeding through the crowd with a body of young patricians, ordered him taken into confinement. Now not only the multitude, but also Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius, leaders of the crowd, surrounded Icilius. They repelled the lictor, stating that, if he meant to proceed by law, they would protect Icilius from one who was merely a private citizen. If he desired to employ force, they would be no bad match for him even then. A furious scuffle ensued. The Decemvir's lictor attacked Valerius and Horatius, and the fasces were broken by the people. Appius ascended the tribunal. Horatius and Valerius followed him. The assembly paid attention to them, drowning out the Decemvir's voice with clamor. Valerius then authoritatively ordered the lictors to depart from Appius, now a private citizen. Appius, his spirit broken and fearing for his life, covered his head and retreated into a nearby house, unknown to his enemies. Spurius Appius, to assist his colleague, rushed into the forum from the opposite side. He saw their authority overthrown by force. Distracted by wavering counsels and assenting to various advisers, he eventually ordered the Senate convened. As the Decemvir's actions seemed to displease most of the patricians, this step quieted the people with the hope that the government would be abolished through the Senate. The Senate opined that the commoners should not be exasperated, and even more, care should be taken that Verginius's arrival did not cause commotion in the army. Accordingly, some junior patricians were sent to the camp, then on Mount Vasilius, to inform the Decemvirs that by every means in their power they should prevent the soldiers from mutinying. There, Verginius caused greater commotion than he had left behind in the city. Besides being seen with a body of nearly 400 men, who, enraged by the heinous atrocity, had accompanied him from the city, his unsheathed, blood-stained weapon attracted the entire camp. The civilian gowns seen in different parts of the camp made the number of people from the city appear much greater than it was. When they asked him what was the matter, he uttered not a word due to his weeping. At length, as the crowd of those running together grew still and silence fell, he related everything in order as it occurred. Then, extending his hands towards heaven, addressing his fellow soldiers, he begged them not to impute to him Appius's crime, nor to abhor him as the murderer of his children. He explained that his daughter's life was dearer than his own if she had been allowed to live in freedom and chastity. But when he saw her dragged to prostitution as if a slave, thinking it better that his child be lost by death than by dishonor, through compassion for her, he acted with what appeared to be cruelty. Nor would he have survived his daughter had he not placed hope of avenging her death in the aid of his fellow soldiers. He reminded them that they too had daughters, sisters, and wives. He warned that Appius Claudius's lust was not extinguished with his daughter. Rather, the more it escaped with impunity, the more unbridled it would become. He urged them to learn from the calamities of others to guard against similar injury. For his part, his wife had been taken by fate. His daughter, because she could no longer live in chastity, died an unfortunate but honorable death. There was no longer an opportunity in his house for Appius's lust. He declared that he would defend himself from any other violence with the same spirit with which he vindicated his daughter. He urged others to take care of themselves and their children. To Verginius, uttering these words loudly, the multitude responded with a shout, that they would not be backward with respect either to his wrongs or their own liberty. The civilians mingled with the soldiers, sorrowfully recounting the events, emphasizing how much more shocking they were to witness than to merely hear. They also reported that matters in Rome were desperate. Those who had followed Verginius further claimed that Appius, having narrowly escaped with his life, had gone into exile. All these individuals so influenced them that there was a general cry to arms. They snatched up their standards and set out for Rome. The Decemvirs, alarmed by what they now saw and what they had heard from Rome, ran to different parts of the camp to quell the commotion. While they proceeded with mildness, no answer was returned. If any of them attempted to exert authority, the response was, they were men and had arms. They went in a body to the city and posted themselves on the Aventine, encouraging the commoners they met to reclaim their liberty and elect tribunes of the people. No other violent expression was heard. Spurius Oppius held a meeting of the Senate. It was resolved that no harsh proceedings should be adopted, as the Decemvirs themselves had provoked the sedition. 3 men of consular rank, Spurius Tarpeius, Gaius Julius, and Publius Sulpicius, were sent as ambassadors to inquire, in the Senate's name, by whose orders they had deserted the camp, or what their intentions were in posting themselves, armed, on the Aventine, turning their arms from the enemy against their own country. They were not at a loss for an answer, but they lacked a designated speaker, having no certain leader yet, and individuals being unwilling to expose themselves to the invidious office. The multitude only called out with one voice that Valerius and Horatius should be sent to them, to whom they would give their answer. The ambassadors dismissed, Verginius reminded the soldiers that a short time before they had been embarrassed in a not very difficult matter because the multitude lacked a head. He noted that the answer given, though not inexpedient, was the result of accidental concurrence rather than concerted plan. He proposed that 10 persons be elected to manage their affairs, and in military style, they should be called tribunes of the soldiers. When that honor was offered to him first, he replied, "Reserve for an occasion more favorable to you, and to me your kind opinions of me. My daughter being unavenged, no honor is satisfactory to me, nor in the disturbed state of things is it useful that those most obnoxious to party malice should lead you. If there is any use for me, it will be derived no less from me in a private station." They then elected 10 military tribunes. The army among the Sabines was also active. There, at the instance of Icilius and Numitorius, a secession from the Decemvirs occurred. The commotion in men's minds, recalling Cixius's murder, was no less than that ignited by the recent account of the barbarous attempt on the maiden to gratify lust. When Icilius heard that tribunes of the soldiers were elected on Mount Aventine, fearing that the city's assembly might follow the military precedent by electing the same persons tribunes of the commoners, and being well versed in popular intrigues with an eye on that office, he ensured that the same number with equal power were elected by his own party before they proceeded to the city. They entered the city through the Colline Gate in a military array, and proceeded in a body to the Aventine through the middle of the city. There, joined with the other army, they commissioned the 20 tribunes of the soldiers to select 2 from their number to hold chief command. They chose Marcus Oppius and Sextus Manilius. The patricians, alarmed for the general safety, though meeting daily, spent more time in wrangling than deliberation. The murder of Cixius, Appius's lust, and the disgraces incurred in war were urged as charges against the Decemvirs. It was resolved that Valerius and Horatius should proceed to the Aventine. They refused to go on any other conditions than that the Decemvirs should lay down the badges of that office, which had expired the year before. The Decemvirs, complaining that they were being degraded, stated that they would not resign their office until the laws for which they had been appointed were passed. The people, informed by Marcus Duilius, a former tribune, that no business was being transacted due to continuous contentions, moved from the Aventine to the Sacred Mount. Duilius asserted that serious concern for business would not enter the minds of the patricians until they saw the city deserted. He declared that the Sacred Mount would remind them of the people's firmness, and they would then know that harmony could not be restored without the return of tribunician power. Setting out along the Nomentan Way, then called the Ficalnian, they pitched their camp on the Sacred Mount, imitating their fathers' moderation by committing no violence. The commoners followed the army, no one whose age permitted declining to go. Their wives and children accompanied them, piteously asking to whom they would leave them in a city where neither chastity nor liberty was respected. Chapter 8. Restoration of Liberty. When the unusual solitude emptied every place in Rome, when only a few old men remained in the Forum, and when the patricians, convened in the Senate, found the Forum deserted, more voices, besides Horatius and Valerius, began to exclaim, "What will you wait for, conscript fathers? If the Decemvirs do not end their obstinacy, will you let everything fall to ruin? What power is that, Decemvirs, which you embrace so firmly? Do you intend to administer justice to walls and mere houses? Are you not ashamed that almost more of your lictors are seen in the Forum than other citizens? What will you do if the enemy approaches the city? What if the commoners come presently in arms, if we seem unmoved by their secession? Do you intend to conclude your power with the fall of the city? But the case is this: either we must not have the commoners, or they must have their tribunes. We would sooner dispense with our patrician magistrates than with their plebeian ones. They wrested that power, new and untried, from our fathers. Much less will they, now that they have tasted its sweetness, endure its loss, especially since we do not use our power moderately, so that they may not need tribunician aid." When these arguments were voiced from all quarters, the Decemvirs, overpowered by the united opinions, declared that since such was the general feeling, they would submit to the patricians' authority. All they asked was protection from popular rage, warning against habituating the people to punish patricians by shedding their blood. Valerius and Horatius were then sent to recall the people on suitable terms and adjust all differences. They were also instructed to provide for the Decemvirs' safety from the multitude's resentment and violence. They set forth and were received into the camp with great joy by the people, who saw them as undisputed liberators both at the disturbance's beginning and its end. For these reasons, thanks were returned upon their arrival. Icilius spoke on behalf of the people. When the terms were considered, and the ambassadors inquired about the people's demands, Icilius, having already conceived the plan before the ambassadors' arrival, stated demands so reasonable that it became evident more hope was placed in the justice of their cause than in arms. They demanded back the tribunician office and the right of appeal, which, before the Decemvirs' appointment, had been the people's bulwarks. They also demanded that no one should be harmed for having instigated soldiers or commoners to seek back their liberty by secession. Only concerning the Decemvirs' punishment was their demand immoderate, for they thought it just that they be delivered up and threatened to burn them alive. In response, the ambassadors said that the demands resulting from deliberation were so reasonable they should be voluntarily offered. You seek them as safeguards to your liberty, not as means of licentious power to assail others. Your resentment we must rather pardon than indulge. From your hatred of cruelty, you rush into cruelty, and almost before you are free yourselves, you wish already to lord it over your enemies. Shall our state never enjoy rest from punishments, either of the patricians on the Roman commoners, or of the commoners on the patricians? You need a shield rather than a sword. He is sufficiently humble who lives in a state on an equal footing, neither inflicting nor suffering injury. Moreover, should you feel disposed to render yourselves formidable, when, having recovered your magistrates and laws, decisions on our lives and fortunes shall be in your hands, then you shall determine according to the merits of each case. Now it is sufficient that your liberty be restored. With everyone allowing them to act as they thought proper, the ambassadors assured them they would speedily return, having completed every matter. When they presented the commoners' message to the patricians, the other Decemvirs, surprisingly, raised no objection since no mention was made of their punishment. Appius, truculent and particularly detested, measuring others' rancor towards him by his own towards them, said, "I am aware of the fate that hangs over me. I see that the contest against us is deferred until our arms are delivered up to our adversaries. Blood must be offered up to popular rage. I do not even dare to resign my decemvirate." A decree of the Senate was then passed, that the Decemvirs should without delay resign their office, that Quintus Furius, chief pontiff, should hold an election of plebeian tribunes, and that the secession of the soldiers and commoners should not be visited on anyone. These decrees finalized, the Senate dismissed, the Decemvirs came forth into the assembly and resigned their office, to the great joy of all. News of this was carried to the commoners. All the people remaining in the city escorted the ambassadors. This crowd was met by another joyous body from the camp, and they congratulated each other on the restoration of peace and concord to the state. The deputies addressed the assembly. May it be advantageous, fortunate, and happy for you and the republic. Return into your country to your household gods, your wives and children. But carry into the city the same modesty which you observed here, where, amid the consumption of so many necessities for so large a number of persons, no man's field has been injured. Go to the Aventine, whence you set out. In that auspicious place, where you took the first step towards liberty, you shall elect tribunes of the people. The chief pontiff will be at hand to hold the elections. Great was their assent and joy, as evinced by their approbation of every measure. They then hastily raised their standards, and having set out for Rome, vied in exultation with all they met. There, the chief pontiff holding the meeting for the elections, they elected as their tribunes of the people, first of all, A. Verginius, then Lucius Icilius and Publius Numitorius, Verginia's uncle, the advisers of the secession. Then Caius Cincinnatus, offspring of him, who is recorded to have been elected the first tribune of the commoners on the Sacred Mount, and Marcus Duilius, who had served a distinguished tribuneship before the Decemvir's creation and never failed the commoners in their contests with the Decemvirs. Marcus Titinius, Marcus Pomponius, Caius Apronius, Publius Villius, and Caius Oppius were elected more from hope than from any services performed. When he entered on his tribuneship, Lucius Icilius proposed to the commoners, and the commoners ordered, that the secession from the Decemvirs that had taken place should not prove detrimental to any individual. Immediately after, Duilius carried a proposition for electing consuls with the right of appeal. All these things were transacted in an assembly of the commoners in the Flaminian meadows, which they now call the Flaminian Circus. Then, through an interrex, Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius were elected consuls, who immediately entered their office. Their consulship was popular, without actual injury to the patricians, though not without their displeasure. For whatever provision was made for securing the liberty of the commoners, they considered a diminution of their own power. First, when it was a point of controversy whether patricians were bound by regulations enacted in an assembly of the commoners, they proposed a law in the assembly of the centuries. Whatever the commoners ordered collectively should bind the entire people. By this law, a keen-edged weapon was given to motions introduced by tribunes. Then another consular law concerning the right of appeal, a singular security to liberty, overthrown by the decemviral power, they not only restored but also guarded for the future by enacting a new law, that no one should appoint any magistrate without a right of appeal. If any person should so elect, it would be lawful and right that he be put to death, and that such killing should not be deemed a capital offense. And when they had sufficiently secured the commoners by the right of appeal on one hand and tribunician aid on the other, they renewed for the tribunes themselves the privilege of being held sacred and inviolable, the memory of which had almost been lost, reviving certain long disused ceremonies. They rendered them inviolable both by religious institution and by a law enacting that whoever should offer injury to tribunes of the people, aediles, judges, decemvirs, his person should be devoted to Jupiter, and his property sold at the temple of Ceres, Liber, and Libera. Commentators deny that any person is sacrosanct by this law, but that he who injures any of them is deemed devoted. Therefore, an aedile may be arrested and carried to prison by superior magistrates, which, though not expressly warranted by law, for an injury is done to a person to whom it is not lawful to do injury according to this law, yet it is proof that an aedile is not considered sacred, that the tribunes were sacred and inviolable by an ancient oath of the commoners when first they created that office. Some have supposed that by this same Horatian law, provision was also made for the consuls and praetors because they were elected under the same auspices as the consuls. For a consul was then called a judge. This interpretation is refuted because at this time it was not yet customary for the consul to be styled judge, but the praetor. These were the laws proposed by the consuls. It was also regulated by the same consuls that decrees of the Senate should be deposited with the ediles of the commoners in the temple of Ceres, which before that used to be suppressed and altered at the pleasure of the consuls. Marcus Duilius then, tribune of the commoners, proposed to the people, and the people ordered, that whoever left the people without tribunes, and whoever caused a magistrate to be elected without the right of appeal, should be punished with stripes and beheaded. All these matters, though against the feelings of the patricians, passed off without opposition from them, because no severity was aimed at any particular individual. Chapter 9. Consolidation of plebeian rights. With tribunician power and the liberty of the commoners now firmly established, the tribunes deemed it both safe and seasonable to attack individuals. They singled out Verginius as the first prosecutor and Appius as the defendant. When Verginius appointed a day for Appius, and Appius came down to the forum accompanied by young patricians, the memory of his most profligate exercise of power was instantly revived in everyone's minds upon seeing him and his followers. Verginius then stated, "Long speeches have been invented for matters of a doubtful nature. I shall neither waste time dwelling on this man's guilt before you, from whose cruelty you rescued yourselves by force of arms, nor shall I allow him to add impudence to his other enormous crimes in defending himself. Therefore, Appius Claudius, I remit to you the accumulated impious and nefarious deeds you have had the effrontery to commit for the last 2 years. With respect to one charge only, unless you will appoint a judge to prove that you have not, contrary to the laws, sentenced a free person to be a slave, I order that you be taken into custody." Appius could place no hope in the aid of the tribunes nor in the judgment of the people. Still, he appealed to the tribunes, and when no one regarded him, being seized by the bailiff, he exclaimed, "I appeal." The hearing of this one expression, that safeguard of liberty, uttered from the mouth that had so recently consigned a free citizen to slavery, caused general silence. They observed to each other, "At length there are gods, and they do not disregard human affairs. Punishments await tyranny and cruelty, which, though late, are still by no means light." He now appealed, who had abolished all rights of appeal. He implored the protection of the people, who had trampled down all their rights. He was dragged off to prison, destitute of the rights of liberty, who had doomed a free person to slavery. Amid the murmurs of the assembly, Appius's voice was heard imploring the protection of the Roman people. He enumerated his ancestors' services to the state, at home and abroad, and his own unfortunate zeal towards the Roman commoners. He mentioned that he had resigned the consulship, to the great displeasure of the patricians, for the purpose of equalizing the laws, and then cited his laws. Though they still remained in force, their farmer was dragged to prison. He claimed he would then prove the peculiar advantages and disadvantages of his case when afforded an opportunity to state his defense. At present, he, a Roman citizen, demanded, by the common right of citizenship, that he be allowed to speak on the appointed day and to appeal to the judgment of the Roman people. He asserted that he did not dread popular rage, so much as not to place any hope in the equity and compassion of his fellow citizens. But if he were led to prison without being heard, he once more appealed to the tribunes of the people and warned them not to imitate those whom they hated. However, if the tribunes acknowledged themselves bound in the same confederacy for abolishing the right of appeal, which they charged the decemvirs with having formed, then he appealed to the people. He implored the benefit of the laws passed that very year, both by the consuls and tribunes, regarding the right of appeal. For who would appeal, he asked, if this were not allowed a person as yet uncondemned, whose case has not been heard? What plebeian and humble individual would find protection in the laws if Appius Claudius could not? He would afford proof whether tyranny or liberty was established by the new laws, and whether the right of appeal and of challenge against the injustice of magistrates was only held out in empty words or effectively granted. Verginius, on the other hand, affirmed that Appius Claudius was the only person not entitled to participation in the laws, nor in civil or human society. He urged men to look at the tribunal, the fortress of all villainies, where that perpetual decemvir, venting his fury on the properties, backs, and blood of the citizens, threatening all with his rods and axes, a despiser of gods and men, attended by executioners, not lictors, changing his mind from rapine and murder to lust, before the eyes of the Roman people, tore a freeborn maiden, as if a prisoner of war, from her father's embraces, and gave her as a present to a dependent, the pander to his secret pleasures, where, by a cruel decree and a most villainous decision, he armed the right hand of the father against the daughter, where he ordered the spouse and uncle, on their raising the lifeless body of the girl, to be taken off to a prison, moved more at the interruption to his sensual gratification than at her untimely death. That the prison was built for him also, which he used to call the domicile of the Roman commoners. Therefore, though Appius might appeal again and often, Verginius would as frequently refer him to a judge on the charge of having sentenced a free person to slavery. If he would not go before a judge, Verginius ordered him to be taken to prison as one condemned. Appius was thrown into prison, and though without the disapprobation of any individual, it was not without considerable emotions in the public mind. In consequence of the punishment of such a distinguished man, their own liberty began to appear excessive to the commoners themselves. The tribune deferred the day of trial. While these matters were ongoing, ambassadors from the Hernicians and Latins came to Rome to present their congratulations on the harmony subsisting between the patricians and commoners. As an offering on that account to Jupiter, the best and greatest, they brought into the capital a golden crown of small weight, as riches at that time did not abound, and religious duties were performed with piety rather than magnificence. From the same source, it was ascertained that the Equins and Volscians were preparing for war with the utmost energy. The consuls were therefore ordered to divide the provinces between them. The Sabines fell to the lot of Horatius, the Equins and Volscians to that of Valerius. Upon their proclaiming a levy for these wars, through the good wishes of the commoners, not only the younger men, but a considerable portion of those who had served out their time volunteered to give in their names. Hence the army was stronger not only in number, but also in the kind of soldiers, with veterans mixed in. Before they marched out of the city, they engraved on brass and fixed up in public view the decemviral laws, which have received the name of the 12 Tables. Some state that the aediles discharged that office by order of the tribunes. Caius Claudius, who, detesting the crimes of the decemvirs and, above all, incensed at his brother's son's arrogant conduct, had retired to Regillum, the country of his forefathers, returned, though now advanced in years. He sought to deprecate the dangers impending over the man whose vices he had shunned. Now clad in a mourning garment, with members of his family and his clients, he went about the forum and solicited the interest of the citizens individually, that they would not cast such a stain on the Claudian family as to consider them deserving of imprisonment and chains, that a man whose image would be most highly honored with posterity, the framer of their laws and the founder of Roman jurisprudence, lay in chains amongst nightly thieves and robbers. He begged that they would turn away their minds from resentment for a while to examination and reflection, and rather pardon one at the intercession of so many members of the Claudian family, than through a hatred of one spurn the entreaties of many. That he himself also paid this tribute to the family and the name, nor had he been reconciled to him, whose unfortunate situation he wished to relieve. That by fortitude liberty had been recovered, by clemency the harmony of the several orders might be established. Some there were whom he influenced more by his warm attachment to his family than for the sake of him for whom he interceded. But Verginius begged that they would rather pity him and his daughter, and that they would listen to the entreaties, not of the Claudian family, which had assumed a sort of sovereignty over the commoners, but those of Verginia's near friends and of the 3 tribunes, who, having been created for the aid of the commoners, were now themselves imploring the protection and aid of the commoners. These tears appeared more just. Accordingly, all hope being cut off, Appius ended his life before the day appointed for his trial arrived. Soon after, Spurius Oppius, the next object of public indignation, as having been in the city when the unjust decision was given by his colleague, was arraigned by Publius Numitorius. However, an act of injustice committed by Oppius brought more odium on him than not preventing one, in the case of Appius. A witness was brought forward who, after reckoning up 20 campaigns, after having been particularly honored 8 different times and wearing these honors in the sight of the Roman people, tore open his garment and exhibited his back torn with stripes, asking no other conditions but that if the accused could name any one guilty act of his, he might, though a private individual, once more repeat his severity on him. Appius was also thrown into prison, where he ended his life before the day of trial. The tribunes confiscated the property of Appius and Appius. Their colleagues left their homes to go into exile. Their property was confiscated. Marcus Claudius, Verginia's claimant, being condemned on the day of his trial, was discharged and went away into exile to Tibur, Verginius himself remitting the penalty as far as it affected his life. And the shade of Verginia, more fortunate after death than when living, after having roamed through so many families in quest of vengeance, at length rested in peace, no guilty person being left unpunished. Great alarm seized the patricians, and the countenances of the tribunes were now the same as those of the decemvirs had been, when Marcus Duilius, tribune of the people, having put a salutary check to their immoderate power, said, "There has been both enough of liberty on our own part, and of vengeance on our enemies. Therefore, for this year, I will neither suffer a day of trial to be appointed for anyone, nor any person to be thrown into prison. For it is neither pleasing to me that old crimes, now forgotten, should be again brought forward, seeing that the recent ones have been atoned for by the punishment of the decemvirs. And the unremitting care of both the consuls in defending your liberties is ample security that nothing will be committed that will call for tribunician interference." This moderation of the tribune first relieved the patricians from their fears, and at the same time increased their ill will towards the consuls. For they had been so devoted to the commoners that even a plebeian magistrate took an earlier interest in the safety and liberty of the patricians than one of patrician rank. And their enemies would have been surfeited with inflicting punishments on them before the consuls, to all appearance, would have resisted their licentious career. Many also said that a want of firmness was shown in, as much as the fathers had given their approbation to the laws proposed, nor was there a doubt but that in this troubled state of public affairs they had yielded to the times. The city's affairs settled and the rights of the common people firmly established, the consuls departed for their provinces. Valerius, with great prudence, delayed any military action against the Equins and Volscians, whose forces had now joined at Algidum. He understood that, given the recent unfavorable experiences with the decemvirs, a direct confrontation might prove costly for Rome. Valerius encamped his men a mile from the enemy and maintained a quiet posture. The enemy, forming their battle lines between the two camps, repeatedly challenged the Romans, but no Roman soldier responded. Eventually, weary from standing and waiting in vain, the Equins and Volscians, presuming victory conceded, dispersed. Some went to raid the Hernicians, others the Latins. Only a defensive garrison remained in their camp, too few for a full engagement. Observing this, the consul Valerius reversed the psychological pressure. He drew up his troops and, in turn, provoked the enemy. When they, realizing their diminished strength, declined to fight, Roman morale surged. They saw the enemy, cowering behind their ramparts, as already defeated. After standing prepared for battle all day, the Romans retired for the night, filled with hope and ready to refresh themselves. The enemy, however, was in disarray. They frantically dispatched messengers to recall their plundering parties. Those nearby returned, but the more distant detachments could not be reached. At dawn, the Romans left their camp, intending to assault the rampart if battle was not offered. As the day wore on and the enemy made no move, the consul ordered an advance. The Equins and Volscians, indignant that victorious armies would rely on a rampart rather than valor, demanded the signal for battle from their generals, and it was given. As half their forces exited the gates and the rest were still forming ranks, the Roman consul launched his attack. Before the enemy's line could be fully drawn or properly arranged, he fell upon their confused, disorganized crowd. A unified shout and a violent charge added to their already panicked state. The enemy initially recoiled, but then, rallying their spirits, their generals sternly questioned whether they would yield to those they had once defeated. The battle was rejoined. On the other side, the consul urged the Romans to remember that this was their first fight as free men for a free Rome. They were fighting for themselves, not as prizes for the decemvirs. Their commander was Valerius, a liberator, not Appius. He implored them to prove that past failures were due to their generals, not their soldiers. He shamed them, reminding them it was disgraceful to have shown more courage against their own countrymen than against their enemies, to have dreaded slavery at home more than abroad. In peacetime, only Verginia's honor was threatened. Appius was the only citizen of dangerous lust. But now, if the tide of war turned, all their children would be in peril from thousands of enemies. He invoked the Aventine and the Sacred Mount, asking them to restore Rome's dominion to the very place where their liberty had been established months earlier. He called on them to demonstrate that Roman soldiers retained their abilities after the Decemvirs' expulsion, and that their valor had not diminished since the equalization of laws. Having spoken among the infantry, Valerius then turned to the cavalry. "Young men," he exclaimed, "surpass the infantry in valor as you already surpass them in honor and rank. The infantry has made the enemy falter at the first onset. Now that they waver, give rein to your horses and drive them from the field. They will not withstand your charge. Even now they hesitate more than they resist." The cavalry spurred their horses, crashing into the enemy, who were already reeling from the infantry's assault. Breaking through their ranks and pushing to the rear, a portion of the cavalry wheeled around in the open, diverting most of the fleeing enemy from their camp. The infantry, with the consul and the main army, stormed the camp, taking it with considerable slaughter and seizing a great quantity of plunder. News of this victory reached not only the city, where it was met with public rejoicing, but also the other Roman army among the Sabines. There, it ignited the soldiers' desire for similar glory. Horatius, their commander, had steadily built their confidence through excursions and skirmishes, encouraging them to trust in themselves rather than dwell on past ignominy under the decemvirs. These small victories had brought them close to achieving all their hopes. Meanwhile, the Sabines, emboldened by their successes the previous year, incessantly provoked the Romans. They questioned why the Romans wasted time with small sorties, like marauders, instead of engaging in a full battle to decide the war's outcome. The Roman soldiers, already regaining their courage, were further incensed by the enemy's insults. They grew exasperated, hearing that the other army would soon return victorious to Rome. They asked themselves, "When will we be a match for the enemy if not now?" When Consul Horatius learned of these sentiments, he called an assembly. "Soldiers," he announced, "I presume you have heard what transpired at Algidum. The army of free people behaved as they should, achieving victory through my colleagues' wise conduct and the soldiers' valor. As for my own plan, you yourselves shall suggest it. This war can be prolonged advantageously or brought to a swift conclusion. If prolonged, I will ensure, through the same discipline with which I began, that your hopes and valor increase daily. If you now have sufficient courage and wish to decide the matter, raise here the shout you will unleash on the battlefield, a sign of both your inclination and your bravery." When a great shout erupted, Horatius assured them that, with divine favor, he would comply with their wishes and lead them to battle the next day. The rest of the day was spent preparing arms. The following day, as the Sabines saw the Roman army forming its battle lines, they advanced too, eager for the encounter. The battle was fierce, as expected between two confident armies, one animated by a history of uninterrupted glory, the other by a recent, unusual success. The Sabines augmented their strength with a stratagem. Having formed a line equal to the Roman one, they kept 2,000 men in reserve to attack the Roman left wing during the heat of battle. When these reserves, with a flank attack, began to overwhelm the nearly surrounded Roman wing, about 600 cavalry from 2 legions dismounted. They rushed forward in front of their faltering comrades, simultaneously checking the enemy's advance and rekindling the infantry's courage, first by sharing the danger and then by arousing a sense of shame. It was a disgrace, they realized, that the cavalry should fight as both horsemen and foot soldiers, while the infantry could not match even dismounted cavalry. Thus spurred, the infantry pressed forward, regaining lost ground. In an instant, the battle was not only restored, but one of the Sabine wings began to yield. The Roman cavalry, having fought within the foot soldier ranks, returned to their horses. They then galloped to the other division to report their success and simultaneously charged the enemy, who were now disheartened by the defeat of their stronger wing. No one's valor shone more conspicuously in that battle than the consul's. He anticipated all emergencies, praised the brave, and rebuked wherever the battle seemed to falter. When reproved, the soldiers immediately displayed renewed energy, driven by shame as much as others were by praise. A united shout rose anew, and with a concerted effort, they drove the enemy back. Roman power could no longer be resisted. The Sabines, scattered across the countryside, abandoned their camp as plunder. Here, the Romans recovered not the property of allies, as at Algidum, but their own possessions lost to the enemy's depredations. For this double victory, achieved in 2 battles in 2 different places, the Senate, through jealousy, decreed only a single day of supplication in the consuls' names. However, the people, of their own accord, went in great numbers on the 2nd day to offer thanksgiving. This unauthorized, popular supplication was even more zealously attended. The consuls, by agreement, returned to the city within the same 2 days and convened the Senate in the Campus Martius. There, as they recounted their achievements, the leading patricians complained that the Senate had been deliberately called to meet among soldiers, implying intimidation. To counter this charge, the consuls moved the Senate to the Flaminian Meadows, where the Temple of Apollo now stands. When a triumph was refused by a large majority of the patricians, Lucius Icilius, tribune of the commons, proposed to the people that the consuls be granted a triumph. Many opposed the measure, notably Gaius Claudius, who exclaimed that the consuls wished to triumph over the Senate, not the enemy. He argued it was a reward for private service to a tribune, not an honor for valor. He asserted that triumphs had never before been decided by the people, but always by the Senate, whose majesty even kings had respected. He warned that tribunes should not usurp every department of authority, leaving no public council. True liberty and equal laws, he declared, would only exist if each rank retained its own rights and dignity. Despite similar arguments from other senior patricians, all the tribes approved Icilius's proposition. Thus, for the first time, a triumph was celebrated by order of the people, without the Senate's authority. The victory of the tribunes and the people almost led to an unwise excess, a conspiracy among the tribunes to secure their own re-election. To mask their ambition, they also proposed continuing the consuls' terms. They argued this was necessary due to patrician efforts to undermine commoners' privileges, evidenced by the slights against the consuls. They feared what would happen, with laws still unsettled, if consuls, swayed by faction, attacked new tribunes, reminding everyone that Horatius and Valerius, who prioritized liberty, would not always be consuls. By a fortunate turn of events, Marcus Duilius was chosen to preside over the elections. A prudent man, he perceived the brewing storm of public disapproval that would arise from continued terms. He declared he would ignore the former tribunes. His colleagues strenuously insisted he allow the tribes to vote freely or cede his role to others who would conduct the election according to law, rather than patrician preference. A dispute arose. Duilius summoned the consuls and asked their intentions regarding the consular elections. When they confirmed they would appoint new consuls, Duilius, now supported by popular sentiment for a seemingly unpopular measure, brought them before the assembly. When asked if they would serve again should the Roman people, mindful of their liberty restored and their military service, re-elect them, the consuls remained firm in their decision not to serve again. Duilius, praising the consuls for their unwavering opposition to the Decemvir's ways, then held the election. After 5 tribunes were elected, and the remaining candidates failed to secure enough votes due to the aggressive campaigning of the 9 aspiring tribunes, Duilius dismissed the assembly. He held no further elections that year, stating he had fulfilled the law, which only mandated that tribunes be left in office, without specifying a number. He advised the elected tribunes to choose their own colleagues, citing a law that allowed for duly elected tribunes to select additional colleagues if fewer than 10 were chosen. Duilius persisted, arguing that Rome could not have 15 tribunes. After thwarting his colleagues' ambition, he resigned, earning the approval of both patricians and plebeians. The newly elected tribunes, in choosing their colleagues, showed a willingness to appease the patricians, even electing 2 patricians, Spurius Tarpeius and Aulus Atirius, both of consular rank. The consuls then elected, Largius Herminius and Titus Verginius Celiomontanus, were neutral in the conflict between patricians and plebeians. They oversaw a period of perfect tranquility, both at home and abroad. However, Lucius Trebonius, a tribune of the commons, angered by what he perceived as deceit from the patricians in the matter of choosing colleagues, and betrayal by his own colleagues, proposed a law. Whoever takes the votes of the commons in electing tribunes of the people shall continue taking votes until 10 tribunes of the people are elected. He spent his tribuneship harassing the patricians, earning him the nickname Asper, or the Harsh. Next, Marcus Geganius Massarinus and Gaius Julius, elected consuls, quelled some tribunician plots against the young nobility. They did so without harsh measures against tribunician power and maintained patrician dignity. By proclaiming a levy for war against the Volscians and Equins, they diverted the people from unrest, asserting that peace abroad depended on harmony in the city, and that civil discord emboldened enemies. Their desire for external peace fostered internal concord. Yet, each order invariably took advantage of moderation in the other. Injustices began to be committed by younger patricians against the quiescent commoners. When the tribunes attempted to aid the weaker party, their efforts were initially ineffective, and eventually they themselves suffered ill treatment. This was particularly true in the later months of the year, when powerful factions committed injustice, and the vigor of all magistracies waned. Now, the commoners placed their hopes in the tribuneship only if they had tribunes like Icilius, believing that for the past 2 years they had had only empty titles. Conversely, the elder patricians, while acknowledging their young men's excessive arrogance, preferred their own order to exhibit an excess of spirit rather than their adversaries. So difficult is moderation in maintaining liberty, where each person, pretending to seek equality, elevates himself by demeaning another. In guarding against fear, men become objects of dread, and we foist onto others the injustices we ourselves cast off, as if it were truly necessary either to inflict injustice or endure it. Titus Quintius Capitolinus, in his 4th term, and Agrippa Furius were then elected consuls. They found neither domestic unrest nor foreign war, though both loomed. Citizen discord could no longer be contained. Tribunes and commoners were infuriated with the patricians, and any trial date set for a nobleman invariably plunged assemblies into new conflicts. At the first sign of this turmoil, the Equins and Volscians, as if signaled, took up arms. Their leaders, eager for plunder, convinced them that the levy proclaimed 2 years prior could not proceed due to the commoners' disobedience. They argued that no armies were being sent against them, that military discipline was subverted by licentiousness, and that Rome was no longer a united country. Whatever resentment they held against foreigners, the leaders claimed, was now turned inward. This, they believed, was an opportunity to destroy these Romans, blinded by internal rage. Uniting their forces, they first ravaged Latin territory. Finding no resistance, they then, to the great exultation of the war's instigators, approached the very walls of Rome. They carried their depredations into the district around the Esquiline Gate, insulting the city by showcasing the devastation of its land. When they retreated unmolested to Corbio, driving their plunder before them, Consul Quintius summoned the people to an assembly. There, I find he spoke to this effect: "Romans, though I am conscious of no fault in myself, I stand before your assembly with the greatest shame. You should know this, and it should be recorded for posterity, that the Equins and Volscians, who a short time ago were barely a match for the Hernicians, have with impunity reached the walls of Rome with arms in their hands, in the 4th consulate of Titus Quintius. Had I known this ignominy was reserved for this specific year, though we have lived for so long in such a state that my mind could augur nothing good. I would have avoided this honor, even by exile or death, if no other escape existed. If brave men had possessed the arms that were at our gates, could Rome have fallen during my consulate? I have had sufficient honors, enough and more than enough of life. I should have died in my third consulate. Whom did these cowardly enemies despise? Us consuls, or you citizens? If the fault is ours, remove us from command as unworthy, and if that is insufficient, further punish us. If the fault is yours, may no god or man punish your offenses, only repent of them. It is not your cowardice they have despised, nor their own valor they have trusted. For they have been so often routed, put to flight, stripped of their camps, fined in their lands, sent under the yoke, they know both themselves and you. The discord among the different orders is the bane of this city. The contests of the patricians and commoners have emboldened our enemies. We have no limits in the pursuit of power, nor you in that of liberty. You are weary of patrician magistrates, and they of plebeian ones. In the name of heaven, what do you want? You coveted tribunes of the commons. We conceded them for concord. You longed for decemvirs. We suffered them to be created. You grew weary of decemvirs. We compelled them to resign. Your resentment against these same persons, even after they became private citizens, still continued, and we allowed men of the highest families and rank to die or go into exile. You wished again to create tribunes of the commons. You created them. Though we saw it was unjust to the patricians to create consuls in your own interest, we have even seen a patrician magistracy conceded as an offering to the people. The aid of tribunes, the right of appeal to the people, the acts of the commons made binding on the patricians under the pretext of equalizing the laws, the subversion of our privileges, we have borne and still bear all this. What end will there be to our dissensions? When shall we be allowed to have a united city? When is one common country? When defeated, we submit with more resignation than you do when victorious. Is it enough for you that you are objects of terror to us? The Aventine is seized against us the sacred mount is occupied. When the Esquiline is almost taken by the enemy, and when the Volscian foe scales your rampart, there is no one to dislodge him. Against us you are men, against us you take up arms. Come, when you have blockaded the Senate house here, and made the Forum the seat of war, and filled the prison with the leading men of the state, then march forth through the Esquiline gate with that same determined spirit. Or, if you do not even venture thus far, behold from your walls the lands laid waste with fire and sword, booty driven off, and houses everywhere set ablaze and smoking. But, I may be told, it is the public weal that is in a worse condition through these results. The land is burned, the city is besieged, all the glory of the war is centered in the enemy. What, in the name of heaven, is the state of your own private interest? Just now, each of you heard of your own private losses from the lands. What, pray, is there at home from which you may replenish them? Will the tribunes restore and compensate you for what you have lost? Of sound and words they will heap on you as much as you please. Charges against leading men, laws upon laws, and public meetings. But from these meetings, none of you has ever returned home wealthier or more fortunate. Has anyone ever brought back to his wife and children anything save hatred, quarrels, grudges, public and private? From these, and their effects, you have always been protected, not by your own valor or integrity, but by the aid of others. But when you served under the guidance of us consuls, not under your tribunes, and the enemy trembled at your shout on the battlefield, not the Roman patricians in the assembly, then, with booty obtained and land taken from the enemy, with a plentiful stock of wealth and glory, both public and private, you used to return home in triumph to your household gods. Now you allow the enemy to depart laden with your property. Continue immovably tied to your assemblies, live in the Forum. The necessity of taking the field, which you avoid, still follows you. Was it too hard for you to march against the Equins and the Volscians? The war is at your gates. If it is not repelled from there, it will soon be within your walls, and will scale the citadel and capitol, and follow you into your very houses. 2 years ago, the Senate ordered a levy to be held, and the army to march to Algidum. Yet we sit listless at home, quarreling with each other like women, delighting in present peace, and not seeing that after that short-lived intermission, complicated wars are sure to return. I know well that there are other topics more pleasing than these. But even if my own mind did not prompt me, necessity obliges me to speak what is true instead of what is pleasing. I would indeed be anxious to please you, Romans, but I am much more anxious that you should be preserved, whatever sentiments you may harbor towards me. It has been so ordained by nature that he who addresses a multitude for his own private interest is more pleasing than the man whose mind has nothing in view but the public interest. Unless perhaps you suppose that those public sycophants, those flatterers of the commoners, who neither suffer you to take up arms nor to live in peace, incite and work you up for your own interests. When excited, you are to them sources either of honor or of profit. And because, during concord between the different orders, they see that they themselves are of no importance on any side, they wish to be leaders of a bad cause rather than of no cause whatever, of tumults and of sedition. If a weariness of this state of affairs can at last enter your minds, and if you are willing to resume the modes of acting practiced by your forefathers and formerly by yourselves, I submit to any punishment if I do not rout, put to flight, and strip of their camp those ravagers of our lands, and transfer from our gates and walls to their cities this terror of war, by which you are now thrown into consternation. Rarely was a popular tribune's speech more welcome to the common people than this one from a very strict consul. Even the young men, who, during past emergencies, had used refusal to enlist as their sharpest weapon against the patricians, now turned their thoughts to war. The sight of fleeing rustics and those wounded and robbed in the fields, coupled with reports more horrifying than what was visible, filled the city with a spirit of vengeance. When the Senate assembled, all eyes turned to Quintius, seeing him as the sole champion of Roman majesty. Leading senators declared his speech worthy of consular authority, worthy of his many consulships, and worthy of his entire life, full of honors frequently enjoyed and even more frequently deserved. They noted that other consuls had either flattered the commoners by betraying patrician dignity or, by harshly upholding their own rights, made the multitude more difficult to subdue. Titus Quintius, however, had spoken mindfully of patrician dignity, concord among the orders, and above all, the critical times. They implored him and his colleague to champion the commonwealth's interests. They entreated the tribunes to cooperate with the consuls in repelling the war from the city and its walls, and to persuade the commoners to obey the Senate in such a perilous juncture. With their lands devastated and their city virtually besieged, their common country appealed to them, the tribunes, for aid. By universal consent, the levy was decreed and held. The consuls announced that there was no time for excuses. All young men must report to the Campus Martius at dawn the next morning. After the war, they would address the excuses of those who had not enlisted. Anyone whose excuse was not satisfied would be considered a deserter. The entire youth of Rome reported the next day. The cohorts chose their centurions, and 2 senators were placed at the head of each. We are told that all these measures were completed with such speed that the standards, brought from the treasury that very day by the quaestors and conveyed to the Campus Martius, began to move at the 4th hour. The newly raised army halted at the 10th milestone, followed by a few volunteer veteran cohorts. The next day brought the enemy into view, and camp was joined to camp near Corbio. On the 3rd day, urged by Roman resentment and the enemy's consciousness of guilt for their repeated rebellions and despair of pardon, battle was joined without delay. In the Roman army, though both consuls held equal authority, Agrippa graciously yielded supreme command to his colleague, Quintius, a wise move in critical matters. Quintius politely acknowledged Agrippa's ready condescension by sharing all his plans, honors, and treating him as an equal despite his elevated role. On the battlefield, Quintius commanded the right wing, Agrippa the left, and Spurius Postumius Albus, as lieutenant general, led the center. Servius Sulpicius, the other lieutenant general, commanded the cavalry. The infantry on the right wing fought with distinguished valor against stout Volscian resistance. Servius Sulpicius broke through the enemy's center with his cavalry. Although he could have returned the same way before the enemy could restore their broken ranks, he decided it was better to attack their rear. A two-pronged assault would have instantly dispersed the enemy, had not the equine and Volscian cavalry intercepted him, engaging him in similar combat. Sulpicius then declared there was no time for delay, crying out that they were surrounded and cut off from their friends unless they united all efforts and swiftly ended the cavalry engagement. It was not enough to rout the enemy without disabling them. They must slay both horses and men to prevent them from returning or renewing the battle. They could not resist those before whom a compact body of infantry had given way. His orders were heeded. With one charge, they routed the entire cavalry, dismounted many, and killed both men and horses with their javelins. This ended the cavalry battle. Then, attacking the enemy's main line, they sent word to the consuls of their success, just as the enemy's line was starting to falter. The news invigorated the Romans, who were already winning, and disheartened the equines, who were beginning to give ground. They were first beaten in the center, where the cavalry charge had broken their ranks. Then the left wing began to lose ground before Consul Quintius. The right wing, however, presented the most difficulty. Agrippa, buoyed by youth and vigor, seeing the battle progressing better everywhere else than in his own sector, seized standards from the standard-bearers, carrying some himself and even throwing others into the thick of the enemy. The soldiers, spurred by the fear of such disgrace, attacked with renewed ferocity, and victory was thus achieved across the entire front. News then arrived from Quinius that he, being victorious, was about to attack the enemy's camp, but was unwilling to break in until he learned that the left wing too had been defeated. He instructed Agrippa, if he had routed the enemy, to join him so that the entire army could together seize the booty. Agrippa, victorious, met his triumphant colleague with mutual congratulations at the enemy's camp. With few defenders who were quickly routed, they broke into the fortifications without a struggle, and the army marched back, laden with a large share of spoil, and having recovered their own property lost to the devastation of the lands. I have not ascertained whether they themselves demanded a triumph, nor if one was conferred upon them by the Senate. No reason is given for this honor being overlooked or not sought. As far as I can conjecture at such a distance in time, since a triumph had been refused to consuls Horatius and Valerius, who, in addition to defeating the Equins and Volscians, had also concluded the Sabine War, these consuls were perhaps ashamed to demand a triumph for only half the services performed, lest, even if obtained, it might appear to be a matter of personal favor rather than merit. Chapter 10. The Scaptian Arbitration. A disgraceful decision by the people concerning the boundaries of their allies marred the honorable victory achieved over their enemies. The states of Aricia and Ardea, having frequently clashed over a disputed piece of land, and wearied by many mutual losses, appointed the Roman people as arbitrators. When they came to present their claims, an assembly of the people was granted by the magistrates, and a heated debate ensued. As witnesses were produced, and the tribes were about to cast their votes, Publius Scaptius, an aged plebeian, rose and declared, "Consuls, if I am permitted to speak on a matter of public interest, I will not allow the people to be led into a mistake." The consuls dismissed him as unworthy of attention, but when he exclaimed that the public interest was being betrayed, and they ordered him removed, he appealed to the tribunes. The tribunes, always swayed by the multitude rather than directing them, indulged the people's desire to hear him, granting Scaptius leave to speak. He began by stating he was 83 years old and had served in the disputed region, not even then a young man, in his 20th campaign when operations were underway at Corioli. He then revealed a fact long forgotten but deeply etched in his memory. The disputed land had belonged to Corioli and, after its capture, became public property of the Roman people by right of war. He expressed surprise that Ardea and Aricia hoped to claim this land from the Roman people, who were now their arbitrators, when they had never claimed it while Corioli existed. Scaptius concluded that he had little time left to live, but could not, in his old age, decline to claim by his voice, his only remaining means, a district he had helped acquire as a soldier, as far as an individual could. He strongly advised the people not to harm their own interests out of misplaced delicacy. When the consuls perceived that Scaptius was heard not only in silence but with approbation, they appealed to gods and men, declaring that an enormous and disgraceful act was being committed. They sent for the principal senators, and together they implored the tribunes, as judges, do not commit a heinous crime, setting a terrible precedent by converting this dispute to your own interest. Even if it were lawful for a judge to protect his own gain, so little would be gained by keeping the land compared to what would be lost by alienating the affections of our allies through injustice. The losses to character and reputation are immeasurable. Are the ambassadors to carry home this answer? Is this to go out to the world for our allies and enemies to hear? The sorrow of one, the joy of the other? Could they suppose that neighboring states would attribute this proceeding to Scaptius, an old chatterbox in assemblies? That Scaptius would be honored with a statue for this? No, the Roman people would assume the character of a usurper and interceptor of others' claims. What judge in a private cause ever acted this way, adjudging the disputed property to himself? Even Scaptius himself would not do so, though he has now outlived all sense of shame. Thus exclaimed the consuls and senators. But avarice and Scaptius, its advocate, held more sway. The tribes, when convened, decided that the district was the public property of the Roman people. It is not denied that this might have been true had they gone to other judges. However, the disgrace of the decision is certainly not diminished by the fairness of the title. This act appeared no less disgraceful or hideous to the people of Aricia and Ardea than it did to the Roman Senate. The remainder of the year continued free from either urban or foreign commotions.